What secrets could ancient stones hold that the medieval church desperately wanted buried forever? Most people think Stonehenge was simply forgotten during the Middle Ages, but in reality, it became the centre of the most dangerous intellectual pursuit in 14th century England. The monument stood as a forbidden gateway to knowledge that could destroy lives. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. This is a story for sleep, so get comfortable, dim your screen brightness, and lower the volume to a comfortable level. Let this story become a bridge to your dreams. The year 1314 brought war, famine, and a Franciscan monk named William to the rolling plains of Salisbury. Brother William arrived from Oxford with a leather satchel containing prohibited texts and a mind full of dangerous questions. The church had sent him to catalogue heretical writings at the local monastery, never suspecting he would find something far more threatening than mere books. Salisbury's monks whispered about the stone circle 2 miles north. They called it the Giant's Dance, claiming devils raised the massive pillars in a single night. Local shepherds refused to graze their flocks near the monument after sunset. Pregnant women made wide detours around the site, crossing themselves repeatedly. The stones carried a reputation for madness, disease, and unnatural visions. William dismissed such superstition initially. He had studied natural philosophy at Oxford before taking his vows. Rational explanation existed for everything, or so the Aristotelian texts promised. Yet the fragments he discovered in the monastery's library made him reconsider. A Roman merchant's account from 287 AD described the stone circle as an instrument of sky measurement used by British tribes. Another text, partially burned, mentioned druids calculating lunar cycles at the monument with disturbing precision. A third document spoke of Persian scholars visiting Britain in 425 AD, specifically to observe the stones during winter solstice. Why would educated Romans and Persians travel to a barbarian wilderness for astronomical observations? The question consumed William. He requested permission to examine the monument for his catalogue of pagan sites. The abbot granted approval reluctantly, warning him to make daytime visits only and to carry holy water. Strange occurrences happened near those stones, the abbot insisted. 3 monks had suffered fever dreams after approaching the circle during a full moon. William rode out on a grey October morning. Mist clung to the Salisbury plain, making the stones appear and disappear like ghosts. As he drew closer, the monument's scale overwhelmed him. Each standing stone towered 3 times his height. Massive horizontal slabs balanced impossibly on top of vertical pillars, creating doorways to nothing. The outer circle once held 30 uprights, though several had fallen. An inner horseshoe arrangement pointed toward the northeast. He dismounted and approached cautiously. Autumn grass grew thick around the bases. Lichen covered the weathered surfaces in patches of grey and green. No obvious inscriptions marked the stones, just natural erosion patterns, or so it seemed. William spent hours examining the monument's layout. He noted how the arrangement created sight lines towards specific horizon points. The central axis aligned perfectly with where summer sunrise would occur. 2 stones at the entrance formed a narrow channel framing that distant point. He sketched the configuration in his notebook, adding measurements and angles. A shepherd boy watched from a safe distance. William called to him, asking about the stones. The boy approached nervously, keeping his staff ready. His grandfather had warned him about the Giant's Dance, he explained. During certain moon phases, lights danced between the pillars. Music without instruments echoed across the plain. People who slept inside the circle woke speaking languages nobody recognized. William pressed for specifics. Which moon phases? The boy couldn't say exactly, but his grandfather marked dates when shepherds avoided the area. William copied these dates into his notebook, recognizing a pattern immediately. They corresponded to lunar standstills, astronomical events when the moon reaches its extreme positions on the horizon. How did illiterate shepherds know to fear those specific dates? The question drove William back the next day, and the day after. Each visit revealed new details. He discovered that shadows cast by the stones at noon fell precisely along imaginary lines connecting various pillars. During his fourth visit, he noticed something carved into a fallen stone's base, symbols that resembled neither Latin letters nor Celtic designs. William scraped away centuries of dirt and lichen. The markings formed geometric patterns, circles divided into precise sections, triangles with carefully measured angles, spirals that followed mathematical progressions. He recognized some symbols from Greek astronomical texts. Others matched nothing in his considerable learning. The ancient builders weren't barbarians, they were mathematicians. That realization changed everything. William began visiting at different times, observing how sunlight moved through the stone arrangements. He brought measuring tools, a brass astrolabe, knotted ropes for distance measurement, a water clock for timing. The monastery's other monks assumed he was documenting pagan wickedness for the church's records. They didn't question why he sometimes stayed until dusk. 3 weeks into his observations, William witnessed something that shattered his understanding of history. He had positioned himself at the monument's centre during sunset, tracking how the dying light touched each stone in sequence. The autumn equinox approached, when day and night lasted equal hours. William wanted to see if the stones marked this astronomical event. They did, but not in any simple way. As the sun touched the horizon, its light passed through specific gaps between stones, creating a beam that struck markings on the opposite side of the circle. The beam's position shifted slightly each day as Earth's tilt changed, but on the equinox it would illuminate a particular carved symbol. William rushed to that stone, examining the symbol more closely. It was a calendar, not a crude marking of seasons, but a sophisticated astronomical calculator carved in stone. The symbol showed Earth's position relative to the Sun, marked with precision that shouldn't exist for another 3 centuries. Nearby carvings indicated lunar phases, eclipse predictions, and planetary positions. The mathematics required advanced geometry and trigonometry. William's hands trembled as he traced the calculations. These ancient people understood concepts that current scholars barely grasped. They knew Earth moved around the Sun, not the reverse as church doctrine taught. They calculated astronomical events decades in advance. They possessed knowledge that Rome had lost when the empire fell. Forbidden knowledge. The church taught that Earth stood fixed while the heavens rotated around it. God created the world in 4004 BC according to biblical calculations. The ancients were pagans, superstitious barbarians who worshipped stones and trees. Yet here stood evidence that pagan Britons understood astronomy better than current scholars. If church authorities learned what these stones revealed, they would declare the site demonic. Anyone studying the monument would face heresy charges. The knowledge itself was dangerous. It suggested ancient peoples possessed wisdom without God's revelation, challenging the church's monopoly on truth. William faced an impossible choice: abandon his discoveries or risk everything for knowledge that contradicted Scripture. He chose knowledge. His visits became secretive, conducted during new moons when darkness provided cover. He brought better instruments, including a device he built himself, an angle measuring tool that could track celestial positions with unprecedented accuracy. Night observations revealed even more shocking information. The stones aligned with stars that rose at specific times. Certain pillars marked where bright planets appeared during important astronomical cycles. During his 7th nighttime visit, William noticed something that confirmed the shepherd's warnings. Between midnight and dawn, when the moon reached a particular position, faint lights did appear among the stones. Not supernatural illumination, phosphorescence from minerals in the rocks themselves. Moonlight striking the stones at precise angles caused them to glow subtly, creating an eerie effect that would terrify anyone unfamiliar with natural philosophy. The ancient builders had chosen these specific stones for their light-reflecting properties. The monument wasn't just an observatory. It was designed to create visual effects that marked important astronomical events. Clever engineering masquerading as magic. But something else caught William's attention that night. Fresh scratches marked one of the fallen stones, symbols that weren't there during his previous visits. Someone else had been examining the monument. Recently. He wasn't alone in his forbidden research. William searched the area carefully, finding more evidence of recent activity. A piece of wax tablet dropped in tall grass showed geometric calculations in a hand different from his own. The mathematics used Arabic numerals, strange symbols from the East that most European scholars couldn't read. Whoever left these calculations possessed knowledge from Islamic lands. Another scholar was conducting secret astronomical observations at Stonehenge. Someone educated in both Christian and Islamic mathematics. Someone equally desperate to hide their research from church authorities. William copied the calculations into his own notebook, recognizing their sophistication immediately. These formulas predicted lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, using methods he'd only seen in prohibited Arabic texts smuggled from Moorish Spain. The calculations extended years into the future, including a major solar eclipse predicted for summer 1330. 16 years ahead, someone had calculated when the sun would darken. If that prediction proved accurate, it would validate everything William suspected about the stones. It would also prove that forbidden astronomical knowledge surpassed anything the church permitted. He needed to find this other scholar. Together they could unlock secrets that Stonehenge had guarded for centuries. But finding them meant taking even greater risks. It meant leaving messages at the monument, hoping the right person would respond. It meant trusting a complete stranger with knowledge that could burn them both. William left a carefully coded note tucked beneath the stone where he'd found the wax tablet. He used a cipher based on geometric progressions, assuming any scholar educated enough to work here would recognize the pattern. The message simply stated his interest in collaborative observations and proposed a meeting date. 3 nights later, when William returned, the note was gone. In its place lay a different wax tablet. The message, decoded, consisted of 3 words: full moon, midnight, alone. Someone had accepted his invitation. In 14 days, William would meet his co-conspirator at the most dangerous place in England, conducting research that could cost them both their lives. The stones waited silently, guarding secrets that spanned millennia. They had seen Druids and Romans, Saxons and Normans. Now they would witness medieval scholars rediscovering knowledge their civilization had forgotten, knowledge the church declared demonic. Stonehenge was about to become the centre of the most dangerous intellectual conspiracy of the 14th century. Brother William had taken his first step into an ancient mystery that would eventually threaten not just his life, but the foundations of medieval understanding itself. The monument's true purpose was finally being remembered, and that memory would prove more dangerous than anyone could imagine. 14 nights felt like 14 years. William continued his daytime visits to maintain appearances, cataloguing pagan wickedness for the monastery's records. His real work happened in darkness, measuring shadows by moonlight and calculating angles that would horrify his superiors. Each observation confirmed what the ancient carvings suggested. Stonehenge functioned as a precision instrument for tracking celestial movements across decades. The abbot noticed William's obsession. He summoned the monk to his chambers, questioning why simple documentation required such extensive study. William explained that thorough records would help identify heretical practices more effectively. The lie came easily, smoothly, too smoothly. The abbot's eyes narrowed, but he dismissed William with a warning about spending excessive time at cursed sites. Suspicion had taken root. William would need to be more careful. The full moon rose on a clear November night. William left the monastery after Compline prayers, claiming stomach illness that required privacy. He carried minimal equipment, his notebook, measuring tools and a small lamp with shuttered sides. The 2-mile walk through darkness tested his nerve. Every shadow seemed to hide watchers. Every distant sound suggested pursuit. Stonehenge materialized from the gloom like a gathering of giants. Moonlight transformed the grey stones into silver monuments, casting long shadows across the frosted grass. William approached the central area, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He shuttered his lamp completely, letting his eyes adjust to the lunar illumination. A figure stood among the stones. William froze. The silhouette remained motionless near the tallest trilithon, 2 uprights supporting a massive lintel. The person wore a dark hooded cloak that concealed their features. No lantern, no visible weapons, just stillness. William moved forward cautiously. The figure turned slightly, acknowledging his presence without approaching. They maintained a careful distance, as if mutual wariness governed this meeting. William reached the altar stone at the monument's centre and stopped, waiting. The stranger moved first, walking to a fallen stone and crouching beside it. They began scraping away earth and grass from the base, working quickly. William joined them, understanding without words that something lay hidden there. Together they cleared away centuries of accumulated soil. A cavity opened beneath the stone. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, sat a collection of wax tablets. The stranger gestured for William to examine them while maintaining their distance. Smart. If this was a trap, they could flee before he grabbed them. William lifted the tablets carefully, bringing them into moonlight for inspection. His hands shook as he realized what he held. These weren't simple calculations. They were complete astronomical tables spanning centuries, eclipse predictions stretching from 800 AD to 1400 AD. Planetary position calculations using mathematics that shouldn't exist in medieval Europe. Geometric proofs demonstrating Earth's curvature and approximate circumference. Star charts showing constellations from perspectives only possible if someone understood Earth rotated while orbiting the Sun. Every tablet contradicted church doctrine. Every calculation proved ancient knowledge surpassed modern understanding. William looked up at the stranger, questions burning in his throat. The figure shook their head. No speaking, not yet. They pointed to specific tablets, directing William's attention to the most dangerous discoveries. One tablet showed calculations for the 1330 eclipse using methods from Persian astronomy. Another demonstrated that biblical creation dates couldn't be accurate, based on astronomical observations of star positions. A third proved that ancient builders understood precession, Earth's wobbling axis that changes star positions over millennia. The implications crashed over William like waves. These tablets represented collaborative work spanning generations. Multiple scholars had contributed, adding observations and calculations over decades. Someone had been maintaining this hidden archive, updating it with new data while avoiding detection. The stranger produced their own tablet from beneath their cloak. Fresh wax showed recent calculations continuing the eclipse predictions. They handed it to William, finally speaking in Latin heavily accented with something Eastern. The voice belonged to a man, educated, older than William by perhaps 20 years. He identified himself only as a traveller from Toledo, trained in both Islamic and Christian astronomical traditions. Toledo, the Spanish city where Arabic learning met European scholarship, where translations of Greek and Arabic texts flowed into Christian hands despite church suspicion, where mathematical knowledge the Vatican declared heretical was studied openly. William explained his own background: Oxford education, Franciscan order, dangerous curiosity about ancient knowledge. The Toledo scholar relaxed slightly, though caution remained evident in his posture. They began sharing observations, speaking in low voices despite the isolation. Two men committing intellectual heresy in the shadow of pagan stones. The scholar from Toledo revealed stunning information. He had travelled across Europe examining ancient monuments, finding similar astronomical alignments from Brittany to Malta. Stonehenge represented the most sophisticated example, but dozens of sites demonstrated advanced mathematical knowledge. Someone in antiquity had built a network of observatories across the continent, all using the same geometric principles and astronomical understanding. This wasn't isolated pagan superstition, this was organised science. William shared his findings about the stone's light-reflecting properties and shadow calculations. The Toledo scholar added observations about sound. The monument created acoustic effects that amplified and focused voices at specific points. Ancient gatherings here would have experienced natural audio phenomena that seemed magical. Clever engineering again, making science appear supernatural. They worked through the night, cross-referencing tablets with direct observations. The moon's position allowed them to verify calculations for lunar standstills, the 18-year cycle when Earth's satellite reaches extreme positions on the horizon. The stones marked these positions exactly, predicting where the moon would rise and set during maximum standstill with perfect accuracy. As dawn approached, the Toledo scholar revealed his most dangerous secret. He wasn't working alone either. A small network of scholars across England secretly studied forbidden knowledge. Jewish mathematicians fleeing persecution, former crusaders who'd learned Arabic science in the Holy Land, even educated women who couldn't attend universities but possessed keen minds. They communicated through coded messages left at specific locations, sharing discoveries that could burn them all. William had stumbled into an underground academic conspiracy. The Toledo scholar offered him membership, warning that acceptance meant permanent risk. Discovery meant execution. Betrayal meant multiple deaths. The knowledge they pursued was worth dying for, but death would come if authorities learned what they were doing. William accepted without hesitation. The tablet's secrets were too important to abandon. Truth mattered more than safety. The scholar provided instructions for contacting other network members. He described a system of dead drops and coded messages using geometric symbols. Meeting places rotated to avoid patterns that might attract attention. Each member knew only a few others, limiting damage if someone was captured. The next gathering would occur at Stonehenge during the winter solstice, when multiple members could observe the sunrise alignment together. Before departing, the Toledo scholar made William memorize the eclipse prediction for 1330. Summer, June 16th, mid-morning. Total eclipse visible from England. If this calculation proved accurate, it would demonstrate that forbidden astronomical knowledge could predict God's creation with precision the Church couldn't match. That prediction would either vindicate their research or destroy them completely. They reburied the tablets, marking the location with subtle signs only they would recognize. The scholar vanished into dawn mist heading east. William returned to the monastery, arriving in time for dawn prayers. He moved through the service mechanically, mind racing with everything he'd learned. The abbot watched him closely during breakfast. William forced himself to eat normally, showing no signs of his sleepless night or revolutionary discoveries. Routine had to be maintained. Suspicion had to be deflected. The work was too important to lose through careless behaviour. Over the following weeks, William connected with 3 other network members using the Toledo scholars' instructions. A Jewish mathematician named Samuel, who'd fled Oxford after anti-Semitic violence, taught him Arabic numeral systems and algebraic methods. A former Templar knight called only the Frank shared astronomical texts he'd acquired in Acre before the Order's destruction. A woman who identified herself as Margaret, an herbalist who used astronomical timing for plant harvesting, explained how ancient knowledge survived through practical applications common people never questioned. Each brought different expertise, different perspectives, different pieces of the puzzle. Samuel's mathematics allowed precise calculations the Roman numeral system couldn't handle. The Frank's Arabic texts contained observational data from centuries of Islamic astronomy. Margaret's practical knowledge demonstrated how ancient astronomical understanding had been preserved through folk practices the Church considered harmless. Together they formed a team with complementary skills. Samuel could calculate, the Frank could read multiple languages. Margaret knew which plants and practices connected to astronomical cycles. William could interpret the physical monument and translate their findings into terms that avoided obvious heresy. Their first collaborative project involved verifying the eclipse prediction. They worked backward from the 1330 date, calculating where previous eclipses should have occurred and checking these against historical records. Arabic texts from Toledo provided observation accounts that matched their mathematical predictions perfectly. Roman records showed similar accuracy. The ancient calculation method worked flawlessly. This meant the 1330 prediction was almost certainly correct. In 16 years, the sun would darken exactly as ancient calculations foretold. And when it did, everyone would wonder how such precision was possible without divine revelation. The implications terrified and excited them equally. They were rediscovering knowledge that Western civilization had lost, knowledge that challenged everything their society believed about the past, present, and future. Ancient peoples weren't ignorant barbarians. Medieval scholars weren't the pinnacle of human understanding. Truth existed independent of church approval. December's winter solstice brought their largest gathering. 7 network members assembled at Stonehenge before dawn, watching as sunrise light passed through the stones in perfect alignment with the solstice point. The monument's creators had understood Earth's axial tilt with precision that modern scholars barely comprehended. They'd built a permanent, maintenance-free astronomical instrument that would function for millennia. Standing among those stones, watching ancient calculations prove themselves again, William felt the weight of responsibility. They were guardians of forgotten wisdom, preservationists of truth that powerful institutions wanted buried. Discovery meant death, but abandonment meant humanity losing knowledge it desperately needed. The network made a collective decision that winter morning. They would continue their research regardless of risk. They would document everything, creating hidden archives that might survive even if they didn't. They would train others when possible, spreading the knowledge beyond their small group, and they would protect each other, maintaining security protocols that minimized danger. But danger was increasing. A travelling bishop reported strange occurrences at Stonehenge to church authorities. Local priests questioned shepherds about nocturnal activities near the monument. The abbot confronted William directly, demanding to know if his documentation work was complete. Pressure mounted from multiple directions. The network needed to accelerate their research while they still could. The 1330 eclipse loomed in the future, a deadline and a validation point. If they could survive until then, documenting enough knowledge to preserve it permanently, their work would matter. Truth would endure even if they didn't. William spent Christmas copying tablets onto parchment, creating portable records that could be hidden separately. Samuel encoded calculations into seemingly innocent numerical tables that appeared to be accounting records. The Frank translated key Arabic texts into Latin, disguising astronomical content as theological commentary. Margaret taught other herbalists astronomical timing methods without explaining the underlying mathematics. Knowledge was being distributed, embedded into different contexts where it might survive destruction. But every copy increased risk. Every person who learned their secrets became a potential betrayer. The network was growing, and growth meant vulnerability. By January 1315, 15 people across southern England knew about the forbidden research at Stonehenge. 15 people whose lives depended on silence. 15 people who possessed knowledge that could shatter medieval understanding of the cosmos. The mathematics proved that Earth moved. The calculations demonstrated that ancient peoples possessed sophisticated science. The predictions showed that the future could be known through observation and reason rather than prophecy and prayer. Every conclusion was heretical. Every discovery was dangerous. Every meeting risked exposure. And somewhere in the church hierarchy, someone was starting to ask questions about the Franciscan monk who spent too much time at a cursed monument, taking too many notes, showing too much interest in stones that good Christians should avoid. The investigation was beginning. Time was running out. Spring 1315 transformed the secret research from documentation into active experimentation. The network needed to understand not just what the ancient builders knew, but how they had used the monument. Samuel arrived from Oxford with brass instruments smuggled from a Jewish merchant's workshop, devices for measuring angles with unprecedented precision. The Frank brought copper mirrors polished to reflect moonlight accurately. Margaret contributed knowledge of seasonal plant behaviours that corresponded to astronomical events in ways the group hadn't recognised. Their first major experiment tested acoustic properties. William had noticed that voices carried strangely among the stones during his solitary visits. Sound seemed to focus at specific points while vanishing at others. The network spent 3 nights mapping these effects, one person speaking while others moved through the monument noting where words became clear or inaudible. The results shocked them. The stone arrangement created natural amplification zones. Standing at the centre and speaking normally, a voice would carry to specific outer points, but not to positions in between. The ancient builders had engineered acoustic sight lines matching the astronomical alignments. A priest conducting ceremonies at the central altar could be heard clearly only by people standing at astronomically significant positions around the circle. This wasn't primitive magic. This was applied physics centuries before Islamic scholars would codify acoustic principles. Samuel tested the mathematics, calculating how sound waves would reflect and interfere based on the stone's positions and shapes. His predictions matched their observations perfectly. The monument's geometry created predictable acoustic effects that would have seemed supernatural to anyone who didn't understand wave physics. Ancient ceremonies here must have appeared divinely inspired, when in reality they were scientifically orchestrated. The Frank discovered something equally remarkable while experimenting with the copper mirrors. During a full moon, he positioned mirrors to reflect moonlight through the stone arches. The light created patterns on the ground that matched star positions visible that night. Moving the mirrors to different positions throughout the night, he could map the entire visible sky onto the monument's interior. The ancient builders had created a projection system. They could display the heavens on the ground, making complex astronomical relationships visible and understandable To observers who couldn't track stars across the moving sky, Margaret added crucial context. Her grandmother had taught her that certain medicinal plants should be harvested when moonlight passed through standing stones at specific angles. The practice seemed like folklore, but Margaret now understood it was preserved astronomical knowledge. The light angles corresponded to lunar phases and seasonal positions that affected plant chemistry. Ancient herbalists had used monuments like Stonehenge as massive sundials and moondials, timing their work with scientific precision disguised as traditional wisdom. The network realized they were uncovering an entire system of practical ancient science. Astronomy wasn't abstract knowledge for the monument's builders. It was integrated into daily life through architecture that made cosmic patterns visible and useful. Modern scholars had separated science from application, creating theoretical knowledge divorced from practice. The ancients had done the opposite, embedding sophisticated understanding into functional structures. Their experiments grew bolder. Samuel constructed a wooden frame replicating the stone's key sightlines, creating a portable version of Stonehenge's astronomical functions. He could position this frame anywhere and use it to predict solar and lunar events with the same accuracy as the full monument. The ancient design was scalable, transferable, reproducible. This wasn't unique magic tied to one location. It was universal mathematics that could be applied anywhere. During a new moon in April, the network conducted their most ambitious experiment. They brought surveying tools and spent the entire night taking measurements, extending outward from the monument. The Frank had noticed that fallen stones pointed toward distant hills in specific directions. He suspected these sight lines extended beyond the immediate circle to create a larger astronomical network. He was right. The alignments pointed to hilltop positions dozens of miles away, where other ancient structures stood. Burial mounds, standing stones, earthwork circles. The network traced sight lines from Stonehenge to at least 7 other monuments, all positioned to mark astronomically significant angles across the landscape. The ancient builders hadn't created isolated observatories. They'd built an integrated system spanning southern England. This discovery changed everything. Ancient Britain possessed a coordinated scientific infrastructure more sophisticated than anything in medieval Europe. Multiple sites worked together as components of a single astronomical instrument, spanning hundreds of square miles. The engineering required understanding not just astronomy, but also surveying, geometry, and long-distance coordination. How had supposedly primitive peoples accomplished this? William proposed a radical theory. The monument builders weren't isolated British tribes. They were part of a wider culture that existed across Europe, possibly connected to Mediterranean civilizations through trade and knowledge exchange. The mathematical constants they used appeared in Egyptian pyramids, Greek temples, and megalithic sites across the Atlantic coast. Ancient knowledge networks might have spanned continents long before Rome conquered the known world. Samuel supported this hypothesis with mathematical evidence. The geometric ratios embedded in Stonehenge match those found in temples from Malta to Orkney. The astronomical calculations used the same base 60 number system that Babylonians had employed. Measurement units were consistent with Egyptian royal cubits. These weren't coincidences. They were evidence of shared knowledge systems. The network was documenting a lost scientific civilization that medieval scholarship couldn't explain. Church doctrine held that human knowledge progressed linearly from creation to present day, with Christian civilization representing the pinnacle. But the evidence suggested ancient peoples had achieved scientific understanding that medieval Europe had lost, forgotten, or actively suppressed. Their most controversial discovery came in May during detailed shadow measurements. Margaret had suggested tracking how the monument's shadow patterns changed throughout the year. The group spent weeks measuring shadow lengths and angles at different times and dates. Samuel compiled the data, noticing patterns that seemed impossible. The measurements proved Earth was spherical and rotating. Shadow angles changed in ways that only made sense on a curved surface spinning through space. By comparing shadow lengths at Stonehenge with historical measurements from other latitudes, Samuel calculated Earth's circumference. His result came within 3% of the modern value. Ancient peoples had known Earth was round, they'd measured its size, and they'd understood it rotated while orbiting the sun. Every conclusion contradicted church teaching. Ptolemy's Earth-centered cosmos dominated medieval thought, backed by biblical interpretation and Aristotelian philosophy. Suggesting Earth moved was heresy. Claiming it was round rather than flat challenged literal scripture readings. Asserting that pagans had proven these facts centuries before, Christ was unthinkable. Yet the mathematics didn't lie. The stones told a story that contradicted authorized history. Truth existed in measurements regardless of what authorities claimed. The Frank revealed that Arabic astronomers had already rediscovered some of these principles. Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba calculated Earth's size centuries earlier, using shadow measurements across different latitudes. They understood planetary motions that Christian doctrine denied. But sharing this knowledge in Christian Europe meant death. The Church considered Islamic learning to be contaminated by infidel errors. The network was caught between two intellectual traditions. Ancient pagan knowledge matched Islamic science but contradicted Christian teaching. They were preserving pre-Christian wisdom while learning from post-Christian Islamic scholarship, positioning themselves in dangerous opposition to the only authority medieval Europe recognized. During a June meeting, they tested the monument's most esoteric function. Ancient tablets mentioned using the stones during equinoxes to measure planetary positions. Mars was visible that month, its red glow distinctive in the night sky. The Frank used brass instruments to sight the planet through specific stone gaps, noting its position relative to background stars. By comparing observations across multiple nights, they detected Mars's retrograde motion, the period when the planet appeared to move backward against the stellar background. Ptolemaic theory explained this through complex epicycles, circular paths layered on circular orbits. But the Toledo scholar had taught William a simpler explanation from Aristarchus of Samos. Retrograde motion occurred because Earth overtook Mars in their mutual orbits around the Sun. The monument's sightlines were designed to track planetary retrograde periods. Ancient builders understood heliocentric solar system dynamics 13 centuries before Copernicus would propose the same model. This wasn't just advanced knowledge. This was complete astronomical understanding equal to anything the Renaissance would achieve. The network realized they were sitting on discoveries that could revolutionize human knowledge. But revolutionizing knowledge in 1315 meant destroying accepted truth, challenging church authority, and risking execution for heresy. They couldn't publish their findings. They couldn't teach openly. They could only document secretly and hope their records survived. In late June, danger materialized suddenly. A travelling bishop arrived in Salisbury, investigating reports of nocturnal activities at cursed sites. He questioned the abbot about Brother William's extended studies at Stonehenge. Local shepherds had reported lights and voices near the monument during new moons. Villagers whispered about sorcery and demon worship. The bishop's inquiry was routine, investigating supernatural claims to distinguish genuine miracles from delusional fraud. But his questions specifically targeted the times when the network had been conducting experiments. Someone had been watching them. Someone had reported their activities. William learned of the investigation through a sympathetic monk who overheard the bishop's conversations. The church official planned to visit Stonehenge personally, searching for evidence of diabolical practices. He would arrive within 3 days. The network mobilized instantly. Samuel buried his brass instruments in a location miles from the monument. The Frank burned Arabic texts that couldn't be explained if discovered. Margaret destroyed plant samples that showed astronomical harvest timing. William encoded his measurements using a geometric cipher, transforming astronomical data into apparently random numbers. They had 72 hours to erase evidence of months of research. The group met one final time at Stonehenge, working frantically to remove traces of their presence. Disturbed earth was smoothed. Measurement marks were erased from stones. The wax tablets were moved to a new hiding place, sealed in lead boxes and buried under stones that hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Each member took portions of their collective research, distributing knowledge so no single capture would destroy everything. The Frank made a desperate suggestion. They should stop meeting at the monument entirely, conducting future observations from other locations and communicating only through dead drops. Stonehenge was too visible, too notorious, too obviously connected to pagan practices. Their research could continue elsewhere with less risk. William disagreed. The monument itself was irreplaceable. Its precision and scale couldn't be reproduced. They needed to maintain access while finding ways to deflect suspicion. Perhaps they could convince authorities that studying the stones served the church's interests, documenting pagan wickedness to better oppose it. The argument became moot when scouts reported movement on the plain. The bishop was arriving early, accompanied by armed men and local clergy. He intended to catch heretics in the act rather than investigating an empty site. The network scattered in 6 directions. Samuel fled toward Oxford. The Frank headed for the coast and a ship to France. Margaret disappeared into the forest. William remained, trusting his Franciscan robes and official documentation mission to provide cover. The bishop found only Brother William, sitting peacefully among the stones with a prayer book, claiming to be blessing the cursed site to weaken demonic influences. The explanation was thin, barely credible, but William was a Franciscan, an ordained monk with legitimate scholarly credentials. The bishop couldn't arrest him without evidence of actual heresy. The interrogation lasted 2 hours. William maintained his story, documenting pagan sites to combat their influence, conducting prayers to purify cursed locations, fulfilling his assigned mission from the Oxford monastery. The bishop probed for inconsistencies, looking for signs of forbidden knowledge or heretical beliefs. William gave him nothing. Years of theological training allowed him to answer questions with orthodox precision. He quoted scripture, cited church fathers, demonstrated perfect doctrinal compliance. The bishop found no heresy in his words, only perhaps excessive enthusiasm for missionary work. But suspicion remained. The bishop warned William to complete his documentation quickly and leave the cursed site alone. Too much interest in pagan monuments suggested dangerous fascination with evil. Good Christians should avoid such places, not linger among demon-haunted stones. The investigation would continue, watching for any sign that William or others were practicing sorcery or trafficking with dark powers. The bishop departed, taking his armed escort back to Salisbury. William waited until they disappeared before allowing himself to breathe normally. The network had survived its first serious investigation, but the cost was high. Their meeting place was now actively monitored. Future experiments would require extreme caution or abandonment of the monument entirely. That night, William found a message from Margaret hidden at their prearranged location. The herbalist was leaving England entirely, joining relatives in Ireland where church authority was weaker. Samuel sent word through intermediaries that he was returning to Jewish communities in France. The Frank simply vanished, leaving no indication of his destination. The secret network was fracturing under pressure. Knowledge they'd worked months to gather now existed only in scattered fragments, hidden by individuals who might never reconnect. The monument stood silent, its secrets partially decoded but incompletely understood. William made a decision. He would continue alone if necessary, maintaining his cover as a documenting monk while pursuing forbidden research in whatever limited way remained possible. The 1330 eclipse prediction still waited 15 years ahead, a validation point that could prove everything they'd discovered. 15 years to survive, 15 years to preserve knowledge, 15 years until ancient calculations would either be vindicated or proven false before the entire kingdom. The race had begun, and the church was watching. Summer 1315 brought famine across England. Failed harvests starved the countryside while William continued his solitary research at Stonehenge, using food scarcity as cover for frequent absences from the monastery. Hungry monks rarely questioned why a brother spent days away from the refectory. Starvation provided perfect camouflage for forbidden science. William refined techniques the network had developed, working alone now but building on collaborative foundations. He constructed a portable angle measuring device from wood and brass wire, creating an instrument small enough to conceal but precise enough for serious astronomical work. The device allowed him to measure celestial positions from any location, not just the monument itself. This mobility changed everything. He could observe from hills miles away, triangulating measurements between multiple points to verify the stone's astronomical functions without actually visiting the monument under church scrutiny. The bishop's investigation had inadvertently pushed William toward more sophisticated methodology. In July, he discovered something the network had missed entirely. Standing 3 miles north of Stonehenge at dawn on summer solstice, he watched sunrise align perfectly with the monument's central axis. But from this distant perspective, he noticed that the stones themselves formed a shape against the brightening sky. A geometric pattern that only became visible from specific external viewpoints. The monument wasn't just an observatory, it was also a landmark, designed to be seen from predetermined positions across the landscape. Ancient peoples had created a coordinate system using the stones as a reference point, allowing travellers to navigate by sighting the monument from known locations. Sophisticated surveying techniques had mapped southern England using Stonehenge as a central hub. William spent weeks verifying this discovery, measuring sight lines from different hilltops and calculating angles back to the monument. The mathematics required understanding trigonometry and spherical geometry at levels that shouldn't exist in medieval scholarship. Yet ancient surveyors had clearly mastered these concepts, applying them across vast distances with remarkable accuracy. In August, a message reached William through a tinker who travelled between towns selling needles and thread. The man carried a small wax tablet hidden in his pack, marked with geometric symbols William recognised immediately. Margaret had returned from Ireland. She was hiding in Glastonbury, 70 miles west, and wanted to resume research using the abbey's ancient manuscripts. William travelled to meet her, claiming pilgrimage to the holy site where legend said Joseph of Arimathea had planted his staff. The journey took 4 days through a countryside ravaged by famine. Bodies lined the roads, peasants who died trying to reach towns with food. The church blamed sin for the failed harvests. William knew the real cause was climate. Spring rains had been too cold, too heavy, disrupting planting seasons. Weather patterns followed cycles that ancient astronomers might have tracked. Had Stonehenge's builders understood climate variations connected to solar activity or planetary positions? The question haunted William as he passed starving villages. Margaret looked gaunt when they met in Glastonbury's scriptorum. Months of hiding had aged her, but her mind remained sharp. her curiosity undiminished. She'd discovered something extraordinary in the Abbey's oldest manuscripts, references to an ancient text called the Book of Stones that described how monuments like Stonehenge measured the Great Wheel of the heavens. The Great Wheel. William recognised the phrase from his study of Greek astronomy. It referred to precession, the slow wobbling of Earth's axis that causes star positions to shift over millennia. Ptolemy had documented precession, but the Church discouraged teaching about it because precise precession measurements required thousands of years of continuous observation, contradicting biblical chronology. If Stonehenge tracked precession, its builders had conducted astronomical observations spanning centuries or even millennia. The monument became vastly older and more significant than anyone had imagined. Margaret had calculated something even more disturbing. Using the Book of Stones descriptions and comparing them to current star positions, she determined that Stonehenge was built approximately 4,000 years before their present day. 4,000 years. Biblical scholars placed creation itself around 4000 BC. The monument was as old as the world according to church doctrine. This knowledge was death. Suggesting human civilization existed before biblical creation meant rejecting scripture entirely. William and Margaret both understood they were now documenting evidence that could destroy Christianity's historical foundations. They decided to continue anyway. Truth mattered more than safety, more than faith, more than life itself. Back at Stonehenge in September, William conducted new experiments based on the Book of Stones descriptions. The text mentioned using moonlight reflected through the stones during specific phases to map the wandering stars, planets. William positioned polished copper sheets at angles that would catch rising moonlight, reflecting it through stone arches onto the ground within the circle. The technique worked brilliantly. As the moon rose, its light passed through the stones, reflecting off the copper, creating bright spots on the ground that marked where planets would appear in the night sky. By moving the copper throughout the night, William could track planetary positions without actually observing them directly. The monument itself became a projection system displaying cosmic geography. But villagers saw the reflected lights. Rumours spread about demon fires dancing among the cursed stones. A shepherd reported hearing William's voice echoing strangely as he recorded observations aloud. The whispers about sorcery grew louder, more insistent, more dangerous. The Frank reappeared unexpectedly in October. He'd been hiding in Southampton, working as a dock labourer while maintaining contact with Samuel in France through ship crews. The Jewish mathematician had made a crucial discovery. Arabic texts from Persia contained detailed descriptions of monuments identical to Stonehenge, built by ancient peoples who called themselves star readers. These structures existed from Britain to Mesopotamia, all using the same astronomical principles. The ancient world had possessed a scientific culture spanning continents, knowledge networks predating Rome, predating Greece, predating written history as medieval scholars understood it. Stonehenge wasn't an isolated British monument. It was part of a global system of astronomical observation, built by a civilization medieval Europe couldn't acknowledge, because it contradicted everything they believed about human history. The Frank brought tools he'd acquired from Arabic merchants, an astrolabe far more sophisticated than anything produced in Christian Europe, measuring devices calibrated using Persian astronomical tables and mirrors ground to optical specifications that European craftsmen couldn't replicate. With these instruments, the experiments could reach new levels of precision. They tested the monument's timekeeping functions during the autumn equinox. By tracking how sunlight moved across specific stones throughout the day, they could divide daylight into units of remarkable precision. far more accurate than water clocks or sundials used in medieval Europe. The stones functioned as a massive chronometer, measuring time through light and shadow with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until mechanical clocks appeared centuries later. Most remarkably, the system worked automatically. No adjustments were needed. The stones themselves, positioned with mathematical precision, created a self-correcting astronomical clock that accounted for Earth's orbital variations and seasonal changes. Ancient engineers had built a maintenance-free scientific instrument that would function perfectly for thousands of years. William and the Frank conducted shadow experiments that proved Earth's curvature with undeniable clarity. By measuring shadow lengths at Stonehenge and comparing them with measurements the Frank had taken in Southampton 40 miles south, they calculated the degree of curvature between the two locations. The mathematics was simple, elegant, and absolutely conclusive. Earth was spherical, not flat. They extended these calculations using historical measurements from Arabic texts. Scholars in Baghdad had measured shadows across vast distances, calculating Earth's circumference with precision that medieval European geography couldn't approach. By combining Stonehenge measurements with Islamic data, William and the Frank confirmed Earth's size to within 2% of the actual value. Every measurement, every calculation, every experiment produced results that contradicted church teaching, while confirming ancient knowledge and Islamic science. The pattern was undeniable. Truth existed independent of Christian doctrine, and multiple traditions could arrive at identical conclusions through observation and mathematics. In November, they discovered evidence of the monument's most sophisticated function. Careful examination of stone weathering patterns revealed that certain surfaces had been deliberately shaped to reflect light at specific angles. These weren't random erosion. They were engineered optical features designed to create particular visual effects during astronomically significant events. During the winter solstice sunrise, these shaped surfaces would reflect and refract light in ways that created rainbow effects, prismatic light displays that would have seemed miraculous to ancient observers. But the physics was straightforward. Shaped stone surfaces acted as primitive lenses and prisms, splitting sunlight into visible spectrum colours. Ancient builders understood optics. They'd applied this knowledge to create religious experiences that were actually demonstrations of natural philosophy. The line between sacred and scientific had been deliberately blurred, making astronomical knowledge accessible through emotional impact rather than mathematical explanation. The Church had done the opposite, separating science from experience, making knowledge abstract and controlled. Ancient peoples had integrated understanding into lived experience, teaching through demonstration rather than doctrine. Samuel sent word in December through a travelling merchant. He'd found evidence in French manuscripts that Stonehenge wasn't even the oldest or largest such monument. Structures in Brittany predated it by centuries. Sites in Malta showed even more sophisticated astronomical functions. The British stone circle was part of a tradition that stretched back 6,000 years or more, evolving and spreading across Europe through cultural exchange that left no written records. Medieval scholars couldn't comprehend how knowledge could be transmitted without writing. But ancient peoples had encoded information in architecture, creating monuments that taught through their structure. Stonehenge was a textbook written in stone, teaching astronomy through physical demonstration to anyone who learned to read its language. The winter solstice brought their most dangerous experiment. William, the Frank, and Margaret, who travelled from Glastonbury despite the risk, assembled at Stonehenge before dawn with all their instruments. They would conduct a complete documentation of the solstice sunrise, measuring every aspect of how light moved through the monument. They worked quickly, knowing that solstice sunrise attracted attention from locals who still practiced half-remembered pagan traditions. Villagers would come to watch the sun rise through the stones, maintaining customs their ancestors had performed for millennia without understanding the astronomical significance. The experiment succeeded perfectly. Light passed through the stones in precisely calculated ways, marking positions that indicated Earth's maximum axial tilt. The measurements confirmed that ancient builders understood this tilt's exact angle, 23.44 degrees, and had encoded it into the monument's geometry. This knowledge allowed them to predict seasons, track long-term climate cycles, and calculate astronomical events centuries in advance. But as sunrise illuminated the stones, villagers appeared on the horizon. They saw 3 figures among the stones conducting strange rituals with unusual instruments. They saw reflected lights and moving shadows, heard voices speaking in Latin about measurements and angles. To uneducated peasants, this looked exactly like sorcery. The villagers fled, terrified. Within hours, reports reached Salisbury about demon worshippers performing dark rites at the Giants' Dance during the sacred solstice. The bishop who'd investigated earlier dispatched armed men to arrest anyone found at the monument. William, Margaret, and the Frank had minutes to hide their instruments and escape. They buried the astrolabe and mirrors in a location they'd prepared for emergencies. They scattered their written observations among 3 different hiding spots. They separated, each taking different routes away from Stonehenge. William returned to his monastery, arriving barely ahead of the bishop's soldiers. The Frank vanished into the forest. Margaret fled toward the coast, hoping to reach Ireland again before pursuit caught her. The trap was closing. The church's patience with mysterious activities at Stonehenge had ended. Armed force would now back religious authority. Future experiments would be impossible. The monument itself might be destroyed to eliminate the site's attraction for heretics and sorcerers. That night, William received devastating news. Margaret had been captured by the bishop's men near Southampton. She was being held for questioning about demonic practices and heretical beliefs. Her knowledge of astronomical plant harvesting had been interpreted as using forbidden prophecy to predict future events. The network faced its greatest crisis. If Margaret broke under interrogation, she could expose William, the Frank, Samuel, and everyone else connected to their research. A single captured member could destroy the entire conspiracy. William had to make an impossible choice: attempt rescue and risk exposure, or abandon Margaret to save the knowledge they'd gathered. Either decision meant condemning someone. Rescue meant probable death for multiple people. Abandonment meant certain death for Margaret alone. The mathematics of survival demanded sacrifice. Truth required protecting the documentation, preserving discoveries that might not be rediscovered for centuries. Individual lives mattered less than collective knowledge. But William couldn't accept that calculation. Margaret wasn't data to be preserved or abandoned. She was a human being who'd risked everything for truth alongside him. He began planning a rescue that would probably kill them both. The Frank emerged from hiding to join him. Samuel sent word from France offering gold to bribe guards. The network mobilized despite the suicidal odds. 4 days before they could attempt Margaret's rescue, she escaped on her own. A sympathetic guard who'd been treated by her herbal medicines left her cell unlocked. She walked out during a shift change and disappeared into winter darkness. The escape bought time but confirmed the church's worst suspicions. An accused heretic fleeing custody proved guilt in medieval law. Margaret was now a fugitive whose capture would mean burning. The entire network had been compromised. Names would be extracted under torture. Connections would be traced. Execution was coming for all of them. They had weeks, maybe days, before the full machinery of church justice crushed their forbidden research forever. The 1330 eclipse prediction remained 15 years away, too distant to save them now. Their discoveries would die with them unless they could hide the knowledge so thoroughly that it survived their inevitable deaths. The race against time had become a race against extinction, and they were losing. Margaret's escape triggered a response the network hadn't anticipated. The Bishop of Salisbury requested assistance from the Dominican order, specialists in rooting out heresy through methodical investigation. Within a week, a Dominican friar arrived from London carrying papal authority to examine anyone suspected of trafficking with demons or practicing forbidden arts. Brother Thomas possessed a reputation for extracting confessions from reluctant heretics. His methods combined theological precision with psychological manipulation, breaking accused individuals through logical argumentation rather than physical torture. He considered himself a surgeon of souls, cutting away infected beliefs to save the spiritual body. The Dominicans had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying heresy. Brother Thomas carried a manual listing warning signs, unusual interest in astronomical calculation, possession of Arabic texts, knowledge of Greek philosophy, contact with Jews or Muslims, questioning of church doctrine regarding creation or cosmology. The manual described exactly what William and his network had been doing. Thomas began his investigation in January 1316 by interviewing the abbot about Brother William's activities. The abbot described William's extended documentation project at Stonehenge, his frequent absences, his late-night departures from the monastery. These facts alone suggested nothing heretical, but Thomas noted them carefully in his investigation journal. He questioned monks who'd worked with William, learning about the Franciscan's exceptional mathematical abilities and his extensive knowledge of Greek texts. One jealous monk mentioned William's friendship with a Jewish scholar from Oxford. Another recalled seeing William with unusual brass instruments. A third remembered William asking questions about ancient astronomical observations. The pattern became clear. Thomas recognized the signs of someone studying forbidden natural philosophy, likely influenced by Islamic or Jewish learning. He'd investigated similar cases before, scholars who let curiosity override orthodoxy, who valued human reason above divine revelation. Thomas requested access to William's cell and personal belongings. Church law permitted such searches during heresy investigations. The abbot reluctantly agreed, uncomfortable with Dominican methods but unable to refuse papal authority. William learned of the search too late to prevent it. By the time a sympathetic monk warned him, Thomas had already examined his cell thoroughly. The investigator found encoded notebooks, geometric diagrams, and astronomical calculations using Arabic numerals. Most damning was a sketch of Stonehenge with measurements and sight lines marked in precise detail. Thomas summoned William for questioning that afternoon. The Franciscan arrived at the abbot's chamber knowing his life depended on the next hours. He'd spent years studying theology, preparing for exactly this moment. Every word would matter. Every answer would be examined for hidden heresy. The interrogation began mildly. Thomas asked about William's education, his interests, his documentation work at Stonehenge. William answered carefully, admitting his fascination with ancient monuments while framing everything in terms of combating pagan influences. He claimed his measurements helped identify how demons might have deceived ancient peoples through false astronomical signs. Thomas listened patiently, asking occasional clarifying questions. He showed William the sketches and calculations found in his cell, requesting explanation for the Arabic numerals and sophisticated geometry. William explained he'd learned these mathematical tools to better understand how Islamic scholars led Christians astray through deceptive reasoning. The defense was clever, turning curiosity into anti-heretical research. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He'd heard similar justifications from other accused scholars. The explanation always involves studying forbidden knowledge to combat it, learning heretical ideas to refute them. The logic allowed scholars to pursue dangerous research while claiming orthodox intentions. Thomas shifted his questioning toward theology. He asked William about Earth's shape, about biblical creation chronology, about whether ancient pagans could possess genuine astronomical knowledge without divine revelation. These questions probed for the actual heresy beneath William's careful explanations. William navigated the theological minefield with precision. He affirmed Earth's centrality in God's creation, accepted biblical chronology without question, and insisted that any apparent pagan knowledge came from demonic deception rather than genuine understanding. His answers were perfectly orthodox. But Thomas noticed something crucial. William answered too quickly, with too much confidence, using precisely calibrated theological language. Genuine believers showed hesitation when confronting difficult questions, expressed doubt and reliance on church guidance. William demonstrated none of this uncertainty. His responses revealed someone who'd prepared extensively for interrogation. The investigation wasn't over. Thomas announced he would remain in Salisbury for several weeks, conducting a thorough examination of William's activities and associates. He ordered William to cease all visits to Stonehenge immediately and to surrender any remaining documents related to his research. William complied outwardly while planning frantically. Thomas had found some evidence, but not everything. The buried instruments remained hidden. The wax tablets with eclipse predictions stayed concealed beneath the stones. The distributed network of scholars hadn't been exposed, but time was running out. That night, William discovered something that multiplied his danger exponentially. A monk he'd trusted had been reporting his activities to church authorities for months. Brother Peter, a fellow Franciscan, had been feeding information to the bishop's office since autumn, documenting William's nocturnal absences and suspicious astronomical work. Peter wasn't motivated by religious zeal. He envied William's reputation as a scholar and saw the investigation as an opportunity to eliminate a rival. His reports had triggered Thomas's arrival. His testimony would provide the detailed evidence needed for a heresy conviction. William had been betrayed by someone inside the monastery. The network's security had been compromised from within their supposedly safe refuge. Every meeting, every conversation, every research session might have been observed and reported. The Frank sent urgent warning through their communication network. Church authorities in Southampton were questioning merchants about suspicious individuals purchasing scientific instruments. Margaret's description had been circulated to ports across southern England. Samuel sent word from France that papal agents were investigating Jewish mathematicians suspected of corrupting Christian scholars with Arabic learning. The entire network was being systematically dismantled. Thomas's investigation in Salisbury was just one component of a wider effort to root out heretical astronomy and forbidden mathematics across England. The Church had finally recognized the scale of the intellectual conspiracy challenging orthodox cosmology. William made a desperate decision. He would encode their most important discoveries into a form that could survive even if all the network members died. The eclipse prediction for 1330, the measurements proving Earth's sphericity and motion, the evidence of ancient astronomical sophistication, all of it would be hidden in plain sight where church investigators wouldn't recognize its significance. He spent 3 nights creating an elaborate geometric diagram that appeared to be a meditation on God's perfect creation. The diagram incorporated astronomical data disguised as religious symbolism. Planetary positions were encoded as angels arranged in hierarchical circles. Eclipse calculations appeared as theological contemplations on divine light. Stonehenge's measurements were embedded in architectural proportions for an ideal church. The document was a masterpiece of deception. To orthodox eyes, it looked like standard medieval religious art. To anyone who understood advanced mathematics and astronomy, it contained everything the network had discovered. William called it the Divine Compass and presented it to the abbot as the fruit of his Stonehenge research, a Christian reinterpretation of pagan geometry. Brother Thomas examined the diagram carefully. He recognized sophisticated mathematical content but couldn't identify specific heresy. The theological framing was impeccable. The symbolism appeared orthodox. If the document contained hidden meanings, they were buried too deeply for immediate detection. Thomas approved the diagram's inclusion in the monastery library, never suspecting it was a time bomb of forbidden knowledge that could detonate centuries later when someone learned to decode it properly. William had successfully hidden the truth in the one place inquisitors wouldn't think to look: approved religious documents. But personal survival remained uncertain. Thomas continued his investigation, questioning everyone associated with William. He travelled to Stonehenge personally, examining the monument with an expert's eye for evidence of recent human activity. He found disturbed earth where instruments had been buried, though the instruments themselves eluded discovery. He located stones that had been cleaned recently, their surfaces free of lichen that should have grown undisturbed. Evidence accumulated slowly but inexorably. Thomas built his case methodically, gathering testimony from multiple sources. He documented William's association with Margaret before her escape. He traced connections to Samuel through correspondence discovered in merchant records. He identified the Frank through witness descriptions of a scarred veteran frequenting Southampton docks while carrying suspicious packages. The network's security measures had been thorough, but not perfect. Medieval England was too small, too interconnected for complete anonymity. People remembered unusual visitors, strange purchases, nocturnal activities. Enough fragments existed for a skilled investigator to reconstruct the conspiracy. In March 1316, Thomas presented his findings to the bishop. He outlined a network of heretics studying forbidden astronomy, using pagan monuments for observations that challenged church cosmology. He identified William as the central figure, connecting scholars across England and France in an intellectual conspiracy. He recommended formal heresy charges and trial by ecclesiastical court. The bishop hesitated. Charging a Franciscan monk with heresy would create controversy, requiring involvement of the Franciscan order's leadership and potentially papal attention. Better to handle the matter quietly, avoiding public scandal that might spread dangerous ideas even while condemning them. Thomas agreed with this political calculation. Public trials educated people about the heresies being condemned, inadvertently spreading the forbidden knowledge. Silent suppression was more effective. Eliminate the heretics without revealing exactly what they'd discovered. The compromise decision terrified William more than open prosecution. Quiet suppression meant disappearance, imprisonment in remote locations, possibly death without trial or defence. He would vanish from history without anyone knowing what he'd accomplished or why he'd been eliminated. The Frank responded to this threat with characteristic boldness. He approached Thomas directly, not to confess but to offer information about a different heretical group, Cathars hiding in northern England. The offer was partly genuine, partly misdirection. The Frank knew about Cathar communities from his Templar days, but gave Thomas just enough information to seem useful, without fully exposing the Cathar network. This tactical revelation shifted Thomas's attention temporarily. Cathars represented a more dangerous heresy than scholarly curiosity about astronomy. They rejected church authority entirely and threatened Christian unity. Thomas couldn't ignore credible intelligence about Cathar activities, even if it came from a suspicious source. The Frank had bought time through strategic betrayal. The ethical calculation was brutal but pragmatic. Sacrifice one group of heretics to protect another. Medieval survival required such choices. While Thomas investigated the Cathar lead, William worked desperately to preserve the network's knowledge through additional encoded documents. He created astronomical tables disguised as biblical chronologies. He incorporated planetary calculations into seemingly innocent geometric artwork. He encoded the 1330 eclipse prediction into a poem about divine judgment, using numerical values assigned to Latin words. Each encoded document was copied multiple times and distributed to different monasteries across England. If one copy was discovered and destroyed, others would survive. The knowledge was being embedded into medieval scholarship so deeply that complete eradication would be impossible. Samuel sent his most valuable contribution in April, a complete Arabic astronomical text translated into Latin, but attributed to a fictional Greek scholar. The translation contained every significant discovery the network had made, presented as ancient wisdom only recently recovered. By attributing the knowledge to Greek sources rather than Islamic ones, Samuel hoped to make it acceptable to Christian scholars despite its challenge to orthodox cosmology. Margaret contributed from hiding by teaching her astronomical plant timing methods to other herbalists, disguising advanced astronomical knowledge as folk wisdom passed through female lineages. Women's herbal practices were considered too trivial for church investigation, creating a safe channel for preserving practical astronomical applications. The network was dissolving into distributed fragments, each member preserving what they could through different methods. United research was impossible, but survival through dispersal remained achievable. Knowledge was being scattered like seeds, buried in different soils, waiting for future conditions that might allow germination. Thomas returned from his Cathar investigation in May with renewed focus on William. The Cathar lead had been useful but ultimately secondary. The astronomical heresy remained his primary target. He'd spent weeks developing a deeper understanding of what William's network had been attempting, nothing less than replacing Christian cosmology with observation-based natural philosophy derived from pagan and Islamic sources. This was fundamental heresy, not merely questioning specific doctrines, but challenging the entire framework of how truth was determined. The network valued empirical observation over scriptural authority, mathematical proof over theological tradition. They were attempting to establish an alternative source of knowledge, independent from church control. Thomas recognized this threat clearly. If scholars could claim direct access to truth through observation and calculation, church authority over knowledge would collapse. Natural philosophy would become independent from theology. Human reason would rival divine revelation. The social order that placed priests above scholars would be inverted. This couldn't be tolerated. The investigation intensified with new urgency. William was formally restricted to monastery grounds. He could no longer leave without explicit permission from both the abbot and Brother Thomas. His correspondence was monitored. His visitors were questioned. His every movement was observed by monks instructed to report anything suspicious. The cage was closing. William had perhaps weeks before formal charges would be filed and his fate sealed. The network had run out of time, out of options, out of places to hide. But they'd succeeded in one crucial objective. The knowledge was preserved, encoded, distributed, disguised, but preserved. Future scholars might discover it, decode it, resurrect it. The truth would survive even if they didn't. That consolation would have to be enough. The price of forbidden knowledge was being tallied, and payment was coming due. Years passed with agonizing slowness. William remained confined to his monastery through 1316 and 1317, conducting research only through correspondence and encoded messages. Brother Thomas moved to other investigations but left instructions for continued surveillance. The Franciscan lived under permanent suspicion. his every action monitored by hostile eyes. The famine ended in 1318, but the network never recovered. Samuel died in France that winter, whether from disease, starvation, or something more sinister remained unclear. His last letter contained calculations proving the 1330 eclipse prediction with even greater precision. He'd used Arabic astronomical tables to verify every element of their original calculation. The prediction was solid. Margaret resurfaced in Scotland in 1319, having hidden among Highland communities where English church authority barely reached. She sent word through travelling merchants that she'd trained 3 apprentice herbalists in astronomical plant timing, ensuring the practical knowledge would survive. Her message included a warning. Dominican investigators were specifically targeting women with unusual learning, suspecting them of witchcraft if they demonstrated mathematical or scientific knowledge. The Frank stayed hidden until 1320, when he emerged with shocking news. He'd been working with stonemasons at Canterbury Cathedral, deliberately incorporating Stonehenge's geometric proportions into the new construction. The cathedral's windows, arches and vault ratios all encoded astronomical constants from the ancient monument. Future scholars examining Canterbury's architecture would unknowingly study the same mathematics the network had discovered at Stonehenge. This was genius preservation, hiding forbidden knowledge in church buildings where it would be protected and studied for centuries. Gothic architecture was becoming increasingly mathematical, using sophisticated geometry that few builders understood conceptually, but could replicate through practical techniques. The Frank was embedding ancient astronomical knowledge into Christian sacred architecture. William began working on a similar project in Salisbury. The cathedral needed repairs after storm damage. He convinced the abbot to let him supervise reconstruction of one chapel, arguing that precise geometric proportions would honour God more perfectly. The chapel's dimensions, window placements, and decorative carvings all incorporated measurements from Stonehenge, disguised as theological symbolism. The stone's astronomical functions were being translated into architecture that would survive long after the monument itself might crumble. Gothic cathedrals rising across Europe unknowingly preserved ancient scientific knowledge in their geometric perfection. By 1323, 9 years remained until the eclipse. William was 41 years old, greying and marked by years of stress. His position had stabilised. Brother Thomas had moved on to other cases, and the immediate threat of heresy charges had receded. But surveillance continued. The Church never forgot suspected heretics, even when it couldn't prove cases against them. In 1325, William received permission to travel to Oxford on monastery business. He used the opportunity to contact remaining network members and coordinate preparations for the eclipse. 5 people remained from the original group, scattered across England but still committed to validating their predictions. They agreed to observe from different locations, comparing notes afterward to ensure accurate documentation. The plan required surviving 5 more years without exposure. Then the eclipse would either vindicate their forbidden research or destroy their credibility forever. If their prediction was accurate while church astronomers' calculations were wrong, it would prove that methods derived from pagan monuments and Islamic science surpassed Orthodox Christian scholarship. That proof would be incredibly dangerous. The Church couldn't acknowledge that heretical methodology produced superior results. They would need to explain away the accuracy, attribute it to demonic knowledge, or suppress evidence that the prediction had been made at all. William understood this paradox completely. Success meant greater danger than failure. If the eclipse occurred exactly as calculated, he would need to hide his prediction rather than proclaiming it publicly. Vindication had to remain secret. In 1327, 3 years before the eclipse, church astronomers in Oxford announced their own prediction. They calculated a solar eclipse for June 13th, 1330. based on Ptolemaic astronomical models and traditional calculation methods approved by church authorities. Their prediction was published formally, backed by the university's reputation and ecclesiastical endorsement. William's network had predicted June 16, 1330. 3 days difference. One prediction would be accurate, the other spectacularly wrong. The discrepancy would expose which astronomical methodology was superior: orthodox Christian calculation, or techniques derived from ancient pagan monuments and Islamic scholarship. The stakes had become enormous. If church astronomers were wrong by 3 days, their authority over natural philosophy would be severely damaged. If William's prediction proved accurate, it would validate everything the network had risked their lives to discover. But that validation would also expose the source of their knowledge, leading directly back to forbidden research at Stonehenge. The Frank recognized the danger immediately. He sent warning that William should destroy any evidence connecting him to the alternative prediction. If the eclipse occurred on June 16th as calculated, William needed plausible deniability about how he'd known. The church couldn't tolerate being proven wrong by heretical methods. William refused to destroy the documentation. 15 years of work couldn't be erased for political convenience. The knowledge was too important, too hard-won, too vital for future scholarship. He would hide the evidence carefully but not eliminate it. In spring 1328, Brother Thomas returned to Salisbury. He had been investigating Lollard heretics in northern England but heard about the competing eclipse predictions. His sharp mind immediately recognized the significance. 2 predictions, 3 days apart, represented a test of astronomical methodology that would reveal which tradition possessed genuine understanding. Thomas began investigating the origins of the June 16th prediction. He discovered that several scholars had independently arrived at this date, using methods that weren't explained in their publications. Someone had been sharing advanced astronomical calculations through underground networks, teaching techniques that produced results contradicting official church predictions. The investigation led him back toward William, not through direct evidence but through the pattern of connections. Scholars who knew about the alternative prediction had links to Oxford, to Salisbury, to locations where William had travelled or corresponded. The network structure was emerging through careful analysis of scholarly communication patterns. William realised he was being investigated again, more subtly than before but just as thoroughly. Thomas was mapping connections, building a case through circumstantial evidence that would become damning if the June 16th prediction proved accurate. The Dominican was planning ahead, preparing to act when the eclipse occurred. Margaret sent desperate warning from Scotland. She'd learned that church authorities were compiling lists of everyone associated with alternative astronomical predictions. If the eclipse validated those predictions, mass arrests would follow immediately. The church was preparing to crush the entire network the moment heretical accuracy was confirmed. The network faced an impossible situation. Fleeing before the eclipse meant abandoning their vindication. They'd never know if their calculations were correct. Staying to observe meant probable arrest when accuracy was confirmed. Either choice meant defeat. The Frank proposed a radical solution. They should anonymously inform church astronomers about the calculation error, helping them revise their prediction to the correct date. This would prevent the public embarrassment that would trigger mass persecution while still proving the ancient methods worked. The knowledge could be preserved without the political catastrophe. William rejected this plan immediately. The church wouldn't thank heretics for correcting their errors. They'd arrest anyone who demonstrated superior knowledge. Anonymous warnings would be traced, investigated, and used as evidence of conspiracy. There was no safe way to share the truth with authorities who'd already decided it was heretical. In 1329, 1 year remained. The network made final preparations. William created a detailed document explaining all their calculations, the ancient measurements they'd used, and the mathematical principles underlying their prediction. He sealed this document in lead and buried it at Stonehenge beneath a marker only network members would recognise. If they all died, the knowledge would survive for future scholars to discover. The Frank travelled to Stonehenge one last time, confirming that the wax tablets from 15 years earlier remained safely hidden. He added his own observations, creating a complete archive of the network's research spanning from 1314 to 1329. 15 years of forbidden science, preserved in lead boxes beneath pagan stones. Margaret made one final contribution, a star chart showing the exact positions of visible planets during the predicted eclipse. She'd calculated these positions using Stonehenge sightlines and Islamic astronomical tables. The chart would allow precise verification of the eclipse timing by comparing solar darkening with planetary positions visible during totality. By spring 1330, tension had reached unbearable levels. Church astronomers confidently promoted their June 13th prediction. William's network quietly prepared to observe on June 16th. Brother Thomas watched both groups, waiting to see which would be vindicated. On June 13th, nothing happened. The sun rose and set normally. Church astronomers claimed they'd recalculated and found minor errors, pushing their prediction to June 14th. That day passed without eclipse. They recalculated again, now predicting June 15th. The serial revision of official predictions was destroying church astronomical credibility in real time. Every failed date made orthodox methodology look increasingly unreliable. By June 15th, rumours were spreading that someone else had predicted a different date that might be accurate. Brother Thomas recognised what was happening. The church was scrambling to avoid embarrassment while heretics confidently waited for their own prediction date to arrive. If June 16th produced an eclipse, it would prove that forbidden knowledge surpassed church-approved learning. The entire structure of orthodox intellectual authority would be undermined. Thomas began making arrests on June 15th, 1 day before William's predicted date. He couldn't wait for the eclipse. He needed to prevent heretics from claiming credit for accurate prediction. If they were imprisoned before the eclipse occurred, they couldn't argue that their methods had proven superior. William was seized at dawn on June 16th. The Frank was arrested simultaneously in Southampton. Margaret remained hidden in Scotland, beyond immediate reach. 3 other network members were taken into custody across southern England. The arrests were coordinated, suggesting Brother Thomas had spent months planning this operation. William was confined in Salisbury's episcopal prison, a stone cell beneath the bishop's palace. He could hear activity in the courtyard above but couldn't see the sky. The eclipse would occur without him witnessing it. 15 years of research, and he'd missed the validation because Thomas had arrested him 12 hours too early. The timing was deliberate. Thomas wanted William imprisoned before he could observe the eclipse, removing any possibility that he claimed to have witnessed confirmation of his heretical calculations. The investigation had become a race to prevent vindication rather than punish error. Morning advanced toward the predicted time. William tracked hours by listening to church bells, calculating when the eclipse should begin. Mid-morning, based on their calculations. The sun would darken completely for several minutes, visible across southern England as a total eclipse. In his dark cell, William heard sounds that confirmed everything. Sudden exclamations from the courtyard above, shouting, prayers, the characteristic hush that accompanied celestial events that terrified medieval observers. The eclipse was happening, exactly when calculated, 3 days after the Church's original prediction, at the precise time William's network had determined using methods derived from Stonehenge and Islamic astronomy. They'd been right. 15 years of forbidden research had proven accurate. But accuracy had made them prisoners. Victory had become catastrophe. The eclipse's occurrence on June 16th, rather than June 13th, proved heretical methods worked better than orthodox ones. Exactly the conclusion that would justify their execution. Thomas arrived at William's cell that afternoon. The Dominican's face showed grim satisfaction rather than anger. The eclipse had validated William's prediction while destroying church astronomers' credibility. This confirmed everything Thomas had suspected about underground networks teaching forbidden knowledge. The heresy was proven, the heretics identified, and now justice could proceed. William would stand trial for heresy. The Frank would face similar charges. Margaret would be hunted across Scotland. Everyone connected to the alternative prediction would be investigated, interrogated, and judged. The successful eclipse prediction had marked them all for destruction. The vindication they'd sought for 15 years had become the evidence that would kill them. Truth had proven itself publicly, and now truth's discoverers would pay the price for being right when authority was wrong. The stones of Stonehenge had kept their secrets safe for millennia. Now those secrets had emerged into medieval daylight, and medieval authority was responding with the only tool it understood: violent suppression of dangerous knowledge. The network had succeeded completely, and that success would destroy them. The eclipse's accuracy created an unexpected problem for church authorities. Publicising William's correct prediction while church astronomers had failed would spread dangerous knowledge across England. Common people would learn that heretical methods produce superior results. The investigation needed to succeed while remaining invisible. Brother Thomas recognised this dilemma immediately. A public heresy trial would require explaining what William had predicted and how he'd known. The evidence would demonstrate that pagan monuments and Islamic science surpassed Christian orthodoxy. Condemning heretics would inadvertently validate their methods. The Bishop of Salisbury agreed. He'd been personally embarrassed by the failed church predictions, having promoted the June 13th date from his pulpit. Admitting that a suspected heretic under investigation had calculated correctly would destroy his authority. Better to eliminate William quietly while claiming the revised church prediction had been accurate. Church officials began rewriting history within days of the eclipse. Documents were altered to show that official predictions had always indicated June 16th. Scribes changed dates in astronomical tables, backdating corrections to appear as if church astronomers had recalculated months earlier. The failed June 13th prediction was declared a scribal error that had never reflected actual church scholarship. This institutional lying required coordinating across multiple authorities. Oxford astronomers cooperated, embarrassed by their public failure, and willing to pretend they'd never made incorrect predictions. Bishops across England received instructions to present the eclipse as confirmation of church astronomical superiority. The narrative was being manufactured. Official science had succeeded while rumours of heretical predictions were demonic deceptions. William's interrogation began in late June. Brother Thomas employed psychological pressure rather than physical torture, knowing that Franciscan monks received special protections under canon law. The questioning focused on sources. Who had taught William these calculation methods? Where had he learned Islamic astronomy? What texts had he studied? William refused to name confederates. He claimed to have worked alone, studying Arabic manuscripts he'd found in monastery libraries without understanding their heretical implications. The story was deliberately weak, obviously false, but provided no specific evidence against others. Thomas recognised the tactical lies but couldn't break through them without harsher methods that would require papal approval. The Frank faced simultaneous interrogation in Southampton. His background as a former Templar made him more vulnerable. The Knights Templar had been condemned for heresy 2 decades earlier, An association with the destroyed order suggested inherent corruption. Investigators assumed he'd learned forbidden knowledge during his time in the Holy Land, mixing with Islamic scholars while claiming to serve Christian causes, but the Franks' military experience included resistance to interrogation. He'd been captured by Muslim forces during his Crusader years and survived questioning that would have broken most men. Dominican investigators using psychological pressure seemed gentle by comparison. He maintained complete silence, refusing to answer any questions regardless of threatened consequences. This stonewalling frustrated church authorities. They had 2 confirmed heretics who'd predicted the eclipse accurately, but neither would reveal their sources or methods. The investigation couldn't expand to crush the entire network without information about other members and their activities. Margaret remained hidden in Scotland, protected by Highland clans who distrusted English church authority. She taught astronomical knowledge to enough people that tracking her specifically became difficult. Dozens of women across Scotland now understood celestial calculations for herbal harvesting. Finding the original teacher among all these practitioners proved impossible. By August, Brother Thomas had assembled enough evidence to convict William and the Frank of heresy based on their astronomical work alone. Their predictions had relied on Islamic calculation methods and pagan monument observations. Both contradicted church doctrine. Both men had deliberately chosen heretical knowledge over orthodox teaching. Conviction was certain. But Thomas faced a new obstacle. The Franciscan order's leadership had learned about William's case and sent representatives to defend their brother monk. Franciscans were politically powerful, with connections throughout the church hierarchy. They argued that studying ancient monuments to refute pagan errors was legitimate missionary work, not heresy. William's prediction accuracy was coincidental, they claimed. Even broken clocks showed correct time occasionally. The Franciscan defense was politically motivated rather than principled. The order wanted to protect its reputation, not William personally. But their intervention complicated matters by elevating the case beyond local church authority into higher ecclesiastical politics. The Bishop of Salisbury consulted with the Archbishop of Canterbury about how to proceed. Public trials would attract attention from Franciscan advocates and potentially papal observers. The case could drag through ecclesiastical courts for years, keeping the embarrassing eclipse prediction in public discussion throughout the process. Canterbury recommended avoiding trial entirely. Instead, William and the Frank should be confined to remote monasteries under permanent vows of silence. This solution would eliminate them from public life without creating martyrs or spreading their dangerous knowledge through trial proceedings. Quiet disappearance was safer than public condemnation. Thomas objected to this lenient approach. He argued that heretics deserved burning, not comfortable monastery imprisonment. But political calculation overruled theological rigour. The Church's reputation mattered more than perfect justice. William would live, but his voice would be permanently silenced. In September 1330, William was transferred to a Franciscan monastery in northern Wales, far from Oxford and Salisbury. The monastery sat in mountains where Welsh was spoken more than English, isolated from intellectual centres where his knowledge might spread. He was ordered to maintain perpetual silence, forbidden from writing or teaching, restricted to prayer and manual labour. The Frank received similar confinement at a Benedictine monastery on the Scottish border. His Templar past and military bearing made him too dangerous for Franciscan houses. The Benedictines specialised in harsh monastic discipline, creating conditions closer to imprisonment than religious life. Both men disappeared from historical records, no letters, no manuscripts, no mentions in chronicles. Church authorities successfully erased them from documented existence. future scholars would find no evidence that they'd ever challenged orthodox astronomy or predicted the 1330 eclipse accurately. But erasure wasn't complete. Before his transfer, William managed one final act of preservation. He carved a message into his cell wall using a nail, geometric symbols and numbers that appeared decorative but encoded the eclipse calculation date. A century later, someone might recognize the mathematics hidden in apparent artwork. The Frank had less opportunity for preservation but more resources. He'd bribed a guard before arrest, establishing a channel for smuggling messages. Through this guard, he sent word to stoneworkers at Canterbury Cathedral about specific geometric ratios they should incorporate into ongoing construction. The message system continued even after his confinement, allowing him to influence architecture from prison. Margaret never stopped moving. She travelled between Scottish and Irish communities, teaching astronomical herbalism while staying ahead of English church investigators. Her students spread across Celtic lands, preserving knowledge through practical applications that church authorities considered too mundane to investigate. Brother Thomas, meanwhile, faced an unexpected discovery at Stonehenge. While conducting a final inspection of the monument in October, his men found disturbed earth beneath one of the fallen stones. Excavation revealed the lead boxes containing the network's complete research archive. 15 years of calculations, observations and measurements, documenting how they'd reach their accurate eclipse prediction. The discovery was catastrophic for the cover-up. These documents proved that William's network hadn't stumbled upon correct predictions by accident. They'd conducted systematic research using sophisticated methodology that produced reliably accurate results. The archive included predictions for future eclipses extending decades ahead, all calculated using the heretical methods church authorities were trying to suppress. Thomas faced a choice between theological duty and political expediency. His duty demanded studying these documents to understand the heresy completely, then preserving them as evidence of demonic knowledge. Political expediency suggested destroying them immediately to prevent anyone from learning that pagan monuments and Islamic science outperformed Christian orthodoxy. He chose expediency. Most documents were burned in the bishop's presence, destroyed so thoroughly that no traces remained. But Thomas kept some calculations personally, recognizing their astronomical value despite their heretical origins. He copied selected eclipse predictions onto clean parchment, attributing them to unnamed Greek sources rather than modern heretics. This theft of knowledge was Thomas's own heresy. He was preserving and using methods he'd condemned others for discovering. But he justified the contradiction by claiming authority to handle dangerous knowledge that common scholars couldn't be trusted with. The hypocrisy was complete. Forbidden knowledge was acceptable when church officials controlled it, but heretical when independent scholars pursued it. The Bishop of Salisbury issued orders declaring Stonehenge officially cursed and forbidden. Guards were posted to prevent access, though funding limitations meant enforcement was sporadic. The declaration served mainly to formalise the site's dangerous reputation, ensuring that legitimate scholars would avoid it while only outlaws and heretics dared approach. This strategy backfired somewhat. Forbidden status made the monument more mysterious and attractive. Folk traditions about the stones grew more elaborate. People began attributing all sorts of magical properties to the circle, making it harder to separate genuine ancient knowledge from medieval superstition. By winter 1330, the cover-up appeared complete. William and the Frank were imprisoned in remote monasteries. Margaret had vanished into Celtic lands. The documentary evidence was destroyed or hidden. The eclipse prediction was officially attributed to revised church calculations. The entire affair could be forgotten, except that knowledge, once discovered, couldn't be truly destroyed. Copies of the network's encoded documents existed in multiple monasteries across England. Samuel's Arabic translations remained in French libraries. Margaret's students were teaching astronomical herbalism throughout Scotland and Ireland. The Franks' architectural instructions were being built into Gothic cathedrals. The forbidden research survived in fragments, distributed across different contexts and disciplines. Future scholars might never connect these fragments back to their common source in the Stonehenge network. But the knowledge existed, waiting to be rediscovered when intellectual conditions became more favourable. Thomas recognised this uncomfortable reality. His investigation had uncovered a conspiracy, but couldn't fully eliminate its consequences. The heretics had succeeded in preserving their discoveries despite his best efforts at suppression. They'd lost their freedom and possibly their lives, but they'd won the deeper battle for knowledge preservation. Margaret achieved something even more significant. In 1331, while hiding in Galway, she completed a comprehensive herbal manuscript incorporating astronomical timing for every medicinal plant. The manuscript appeared to be simple practical medicine, but its timing instructions encoded complete lunar and solar calculations based on Stonehenge measurements. The book spread through networks of healers who copied and adapted it across Ireland and Scotland. Women who couldn't read Latin mathematical texts could follow practical instructions that unknowingly preserved sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The forbidden science was camouflaged as folk medicine, hidden in plain sight within traditions church authorities dismissed as harmless women's work. By 1332, even Thomas had to acknowledge that complete suppression was impossible. Too many people had been exposed to the ideas. Too many copies existed in too many forms. The best he could achieve was preventing formal legitimization, keeping the knowledge fragmented, unofficial, and excluded from university curricula. William lived another 20 years in Welsh isolation, dying in 1350 during the first wave of Black Death. The Frank survived until 1347, succumbing to fever in his Scottish monastery prison. Margaret lived longest, reaching 1356 before dying peacefully in an Irish convent where she had spent her final years teaching young women herbal arts. None of them saw their work acknowledged publicly. None received credit for the accurate eclipse prediction or the astronomical discoveries they documented. Their names appeared in no chronicles, their achievements in no church histories. They'd been successfully erased from official memory. But they'd succeeded in their deeper purpose. Knowledge survived. The 1330 eclipse had been predicted accurately using methods that would be rediscovered centuries later. The ancient wisdom of Stonehenge had been partially decoded and preserved for future generations. Truth had been documented even though its discoverers were punished. The stones remained standing on Salisbury Plain, silent and weathered, holding secrets that medieval civilization couldn't safely acknowledge. Guards no longer watched the forbidden monument. Funding had run out, priorities had shifted. Stonehenge returned to abandonment, avoided by superstitious locals, ignored by church authorities who preferred forgetting it entirely. The network was gone, the conspiracy crushed, the knowledge suppressed, but not destroyed, never completely destroyed. Truth, once discovered, possessed a stubborn persistence that outlived both its discoverers and its persecutors. The battle between observation and authority, between knowledge and power, would continue long after everyone involved in the Stonehenge affair had died. The stones waited patiently. They'd stood for 4,000 years. They would stand for thousands more, ready to teach anyone who learned to read their ancient language. Medieval suppression was merely another chapter in their long story, ultimately unsuccessful at erasing what ancient builders had written in stone. The cover-up had succeeded politically, but intellectually, scientifically, historically, it had failed. The knowledge was preserved. The methods were documented. The truth would emerge again when the time was right, and that emergence would reshape human understanding of the past, present, and future in ways that medieval church authorities could never have imagined and would never have approved. The decades following 1330 saw Stonehenge slip further into obscurity. Guards abandoned their post by 1335, leaving the monument to weather and vandals. Stones fell during storms with no one to record when or why. The site's forbidden status paradoxically protected it. Local people avoided the cursed circle, allowing it to deteriorate in isolation rather than being dismantled for building materials like many ancient structures. But the knowledge encoded in those stones had already escaped into the wider world through channels the church never fully understood. William's geometric diagrams remained in Salisbury Cathedral's library, catalogued as religious meditation art. Scholars studied them without recognizing the astronomical data hidden in decorative patterns. The divine compass was copied to other monasteries as an example of sacred geometry, spreading encoded eclipse calculations across England disguised as theological contemplation. In 1337, a mason working on York Minster discovered architectural plans that incorporated unusual proportions. The ratio seemed arbitrary until he tested them practically. They produced extraordinary acoustic effects in vaulted spaces, focusing sound and creating resonance patterns that enhanced choral music. He adopted these proportions for his own work, never knowing they derived from Stonehenge's acoustic engineering via the Franks' smuggled instructions. Margaret's herbal manuscript reached continental Europe by 1340, translated into several languages by networks of healers who recognized its practical value. French midwives used its astronomical timing methods to predict optimal birthing periods. German herbalists applied its lunar calculations to maximize medicinal plant potency. Italian physicians incorporated its seasonal timing into treatment protocols, all unknowingly preserved sophisticated astronomical knowledge through medical applications. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348, killing between 30 and 60% of the population. This demographic catastrophe disrupted church record-keeping and surveillance systems. Monasteries lost half their monks. Episcopal bureaucracies collapsed under the weight of mass death. Heresy investigations became impossible when investigators and accused alike died of plague. This chaos inadvertently protected the scattered fragments of William's network. Documents that might have been discovered and destroyed during normal times survived because no one had resources to conduct systematic library purges. Encoded manuscripts remained forgotten in monastery collections as plague-depleted communities struggled simply to maintain basic religious functions. Samuel's Arabic translations survived in a French monastery, whose librarian died of plague before cataloguing recent acquisitions. The texts sat unexamined for decades, their heretical content unknown to survivors who couldn't read Arabic numerals or understand astronomical calculations. The knowledge waited in darkness, preserved by institutional incompetence born of catastrophic mortality. In 1352, a merchant travelling from Ireland to Bristol carried correspondence that included several of Margaret's encoded botanical instructions. Pirates seized his ship, taking cargo but tossing papers overboard as worthless. The waterlogged documents washed ashore near Tintagel, where a monk collecting driftwood discovered them. He recognised Latin text but couldn't decipher the water-damaged sections. He preserved what remained, filing it with monastery records of shipwreck salvage. These fragments contained Margaret's most sophisticated work: complete lunar tables disguised as planting schedules, solar calculations hidden in harvest timing instructions, and eclipse predictions encoded in seasonal medicine preparation guidelines. The monk who saved them had no idea he'd preserved astronomical calculations that church authorities had tried to eliminate 2 decades earlier. By 1360, the generation that remembered William's heresy investigation had largely died. Brother Thomas succumbed to plague in 1349. The Bishop of Salisbury died in 1350. Most witnesses to the 1330 events were gone, taking their memories of suppressed knowledge and forbidden predictions with them. The institutional memory required for effective censorship had been destroyed by demographic collapse. New scholars emerged in the 1360s who'd never heard of William or his network. They studied the divine compass in monastery libraries, recognizing sophisticated mathematical content, but interpreting it as recently discovered Greek wisdom. One Oxford mathematician spent years analyzing the diagram's geometry, publishing commentaries that came tantalizingly close to recognizing its true astronomical significance without quite making the connection. Gothic architecture continued incorporating proportions derived from the Franks' instructions. By 1365, these ratios had become standard practice among master builders, passed through guild training as traditional wisdom whose origins were forgotten. Cathedrals rising across Europe unknowingly embodied Stonehenge's geometry, preserving ancient knowledge in stone and glass, while the original monument crumbled on Salisbury Plain. A surprising preservation occurred through illuminated manuscripts. Monks decorating religious texts used geometric patterns based on the divine compass diagrams, finding the proportions aesthetically pleasing without understanding their astronomical meaning. These decorative borders contained precise mathematical relationships that encoded planetary positions and eclipse cycles. Art preserved science that theology had condemned. In 1370, a Jewish scholar in Spain discovered Samuel's Arabic translations in a French monastery he was visiting. He immediately recognized their astronomical sophistication and heretical implications. Rather than exposing them, he quietly made copies, understanding that this knowledge was too valuable to lose regardless of its dangerous origins. His copies circulated through Sephardic scholarly networks, where Islamic astronomical methods were already studied openly. Margaret's students, now middle-aged women themselves, had trained the next generation of herbalists across Ireland and Scotland. By 1375, 3 generations of healers unknowingly preserved astronomical knowledge through practical medicine. The calculations had become ritualized tradition. Plant this herb when moonlight passes through standing stones at this angle. Harvest this root when the sun reaches this position. The underlying mathematics was forgotten, but the practices remained accurate. Stonehenge itself deteriorated steadily. A major storm in 1362 toppled several stones that had stood for millennia. Lightning strikes damaged the tallest trilithon in 1368. Local farmers began taking smaller stones for building foundations, slowly cannibalizing the monument. No authority intervened. The site was cursed, forbidden, officially forgotten. Yet even this destruction preserved knowledge. A farmer dismantling a fallen stone in 1372 discovered the carved symbols William had documented decades earlier. The markings meant nothing to him, but he showed them to his parish priest, who made sketches before the stone was broken up. These sketches entered church records as evidence of pagan wickedness, inadvertently documenting the ancient astronomical carvings that William had studied. In 1377, a curious development occurred at Salisbury Cathedral. A mason repairing storm damage noticed that certain decorative carvings incorporated unusual mathematical patterns. He traced these carvings to additions made during William's time, recognizing them as astronomical calculations despite having no knowledge of the heresy investigation. The mason documented his discovery in maintenance records, creating a permanent archive linking the cathedral's geometry to celestial observations. This documentation nearly exposed the entire story. An astute church official examining the records might have connected William's geometric carvings to the suppressed 1330 eclipse prediction. But the official reviewing maintenance records was interested only in construction costs, not mathematical content. The evidence was filed and forgotten. Margaret's manuscript reached its widest distribution in the 1380s when Italian merchants began trading it as a valuable medical text. Physicians across the Mediterranean acquired copies, impressed by its systematic approach to herbal timing. None recognized the astronomical sophistication underlying practical instructions. The book's popularity ensured its survival. Too many copies existed across too wide a geographical area for effective suppression, even if church authorities had realized its origins. The Lollard movement emerged in England during the 1380s, challenging church authority and promoting biblical translation into vernacular languages. Church authorities became obsessed with suppressing this new heresy, diverting attention from older threats. Resources that might have been used to track down William's scattered legacy were redirected toward combating Lollards. Old heresies were forgotten in the face of new challenges. In 1390, a scholar at Oxford discovered William's original notebooks in the Franciscan library. The notebooks had been misfiled decades earlier, labelled as harmless devotional writings. The scholar recognized astronomical content but interpreted it as conventional medieval calculation, missing entirely the revolutionary methodology William had employed. He copied selected passages for his own work, inadvertently spreading fragments of forbidden knowledge while believing he was recording orthodox scholarship. By 1395, the Arabic numerals that had marked William's work as heretically influenced were becoming common in European mathematics. Italian merchants had popularized them for commercial calculation. Universities began teaching them despite their Islamic origins. What had been evidence of dangerous foreign influence in 1330 was standard practice by century's end. The cultural context that made William's methods heretical had shifted, though the specific knowledge remained suppressed. A Masons' Guild in France compiled a comprehensive handbook in 1398, documenting geometric proportions for cathedral construction. The handbook included ratios derived from the Franks' instructions, now 3 generations removed from their Stonehenge origins. Master builders studied these proportions as guild secrets, valuable professional knowledge to be guarded and transmitted through careful apprenticeship. Ancient astronomical constants had become medieval trade secrets. Stonehenge continued deteriorating. By 1400, nearly a quarter of the original stones had fallen or been removed. The monument that had stood intact for over 3,000 years was being destroyed by a century of neglect and vandalism. Yet paradoxically, this destruction made the remaining stones more mysterious and romantic. Travellers began visiting the ruin, writing descriptions that emphasized its enigmatic origins rather than its practical astronomical functions. These early antiquarian accounts created new layers of mythology around the monument. Writers attributed it to Merlin, to giants, to druids with magical powers. The genuine astronomical sophistication William had documented was buried beneath romantic fantasy. Medieval imagination transformed scientific instrument into mystical symbol. But underneath these fantasies, the actual knowledge survived in unexpected repositories. University libraries held encoded manuscripts. Cathedral architecture embodied ancient proportions. Medical texts preserved astronomical calculations. Guild handbooks contained geometric secrets. Jewish and Islamic scholars maintained copies of translations. The network's discoveries existed in fragments so widely distributed that complete suppression would have required destroying medieval learning entirely. In 1402, a remarkable convergence almost occurred. An Oxford scholar studying the divine compass, a mason analysing cathedral proportions, and a physician using Margaret's herbal manuscript were all working in Oxford simultaneously. Had they compared notes, they might have recognised the common source underlying their different disciplines. They might have reconstructed William's network and understood what had been achieved and suppressed 70 years earlier. They never met. The scholar died of fever before completing his research. The mason left for a construction project in France. The physician moved to London. The moment passed, the connection unmade. Yet the near miss demonstrated something important. The knowledge was trying to resurface. Fragments in different fields kept drawing attention from scholars, craftsmen, and practitioners. The truth possessed gravitational pull, attracting investigation despite being officially forbidden and practically forgotten. Human curiosity kept circling back to discoveries that authority had tried to eliminate. By 1410, 80 years after the original suppression, no one alive remembered William's heresy investigation. The 1330 eclipse was historical fact with no surviving record of the competing predictions. Stonehenge was a mysterious ruin without documented astronomical function. The network's existence was completely forgotten, but its legacy was everywhere, in cathedral geometry, in herbal medicine, in mathematical texts, in architectural practice, in artistic decorations. The knowledge lived on, anonymized and fragmented but preserved. Medieval scholarship had absorbed forbidden discoveries without realizing their origins or full significance. This was the network's ultimate victory. They'd lost the credit, lost their freedom, lost their lives, but they'd succeeded in the deeper goal, preserving knowledge for future generations. The truth they discovered at such cost was embedded in medieval civilization's intellectual and practical foundations, waiting to be recognized when the time came. Stonehenge stood in ruins, its stones fallen and scattered, but its wisdom endured in human hands and minds, encoded in disciplines that would outlast the stones themselves. The monument was dying, but its knowledge was immortal, hidden in plain sight throughout Christian Europe that had tried so hard to destroy it. The medieval suppression had failed. Not immediately, not obviously, but fundamentally and completely. You cannot destroy knowledge once discovered. You can only delay its recognition. And that delay was ending as the medieval period waned and new intellectual currents began stirring across Europe. The Renaissance was coming, and with it, rediscovery was inevitable. In 1418, a young scholar named Thomas Bradwardine arrived at Oxford with a dangerous obsession for ancient mathematics. He'd studied in Paris under radical teachers who questioned Aristotelian physics and explored mathematical approaches to natural philosophy. His arrival coincided with Oxford acquiring several new manuscripts from Italian collectors, including a heavily annotated copy of the Divine Compass that William had created nearly a century earlier. Bradwardine recognised something extraordinary in the geometric patterns. The proportions weren't decorative, they were functional, encoding relationships that matched astronomical observations he'd made independently. The diagram's creator had understood planetary motions using mathematics that shouldn't exist in medieval scholarship. Someone had discovered heliocentric principles a century before current debates about cosmology. He began investigating the diagram's origins obsessively. Library records showed it had been created at Salisbury around 1315 by a Franciscan monk, whose name had been deliberately obscured in later copies. Earlier versions existed with marginal notes in multiple hands, suggesting collaborative work. One copy included a date, June 16, 1330, with astronomical symbols indicating a solar eclipse. Bradwardine consulted historical chronicles about 1330. He found references to an eclipse that year but noticed something odd. Earlier records mentioned church predictions for June 13th, while later accounts consistently cited June 16th as the date when the eclipse actually occurred. Someone had predicted the correct date while official church astronomers were wrong by 3 days. This discrepancy became his gateway to reconstructing the entire story. He searched for any records of heresy investigations around 1330 in Salisbury, finding vague references to a Franciscan monk confined for astronomical irregularities. He traced architectural records, discovering unusual geometric additions to Salisbury Cathedral made during the same period. He examined medical manuscripts, finding herbal texts with sophisticated astronomical timing that matched the divine compass calculations. The pattern emerged piece by piece. A network had existed, conducting forbidden research, predicting eclipses accurately, encoding their discoveries in multiple forms before being suppressed. Bradwardine was reconstructing history that authorities had tried to erase. In 1420, he travelled to Salisbury, requesting access to cathedral archives. A sympathetic canon provided entry to storage rooms where old records accumulated dust and neglect. Bradwardine spent weeks examining maintenance logs, financial accounts, and correspondence from the early 14th century. He found William's name, Brother William of Oxford, documented as supervising chapel repairs in 1323, noted as transferred to Wales in 1330. The Welsh monastery where William had been confined no longer existed, dissolved during administrative reforms decades earlier. But Bradwardine traced its records to a Franciscan house in Chester, travelling north through winter weather to examine them. He found William's death registered in 1350 with a note, "Maintained perpetual silence as required." The phrasing confirmed forced confinement rather than voluntary contemplation. Bradwardine returned to Oxford in 1421 with enough evidence to prove that systematic astronomical research had occurred a century earlier, producing results that challenged church cosmology. He faced the same dilemma William had confronted. Sharing this knowledge meant challenging authority, but hiding it meant abandoning truth. He chose a middle path that William would have recognised. Bradwardine began incorporating the rediscovered mathematics into his own scholarly work, presenting ancient calculations as his personal discoveries rather than acknowledging their heretical origins. His treatises on proportions and mechanics unknowingly popularised principles that William's network had documented generations earlier. But Bradwardine wanted more than mathematical vindication. He needed to understand the physical research that had produced these discoveries. The divine compass included geometric patterns that suggested direct observation at an ancient site. References in encoded manuscripts mentioned stone circles and giant monuments. Only one location fit these descriptions within Salisbury's jurisdiction. In spring 1422, Bradwardine visited Stonehenge for the first time. The monument had deteriorated significantly since William's era. More stones had fallen, vegetation covered the ruins, local farmers continued taking material for construction. Yet enough remained to recognise the astronomical alignments that medieval scholars had documented. Bradwardine brought measuring instruments, replicating observations William had made 108 years earlier. He confirmed solar alignments during equinox, verified lunar sight lines, documented shadow patterns that marked seasonal changes. Every measurement validated the encoded calculations he'd found in manuscripts. Ancient builders had indeed created a sophisticated astronomical observatory. While conducting measurements, he noticed something William had documented but Bradwardine initially overlooked. Certain stones showed signs of recent excavation, despite the site's abandonment. Someone had been digging here within living memory, searching for something beneath the fallen stones. Bradwardine began his own excavation, working carefully around stones that showed disturbance marks. 3 days of digging revealed nothing. On the 4th day, his spade struck metal. He'd found a lead box sealed with wax, buried beneath a stone marked with geometric symbols matching those in the divine compass. The box contained wax tablets, remarkably preserved despite 9 decades underground. Bradwardine opened them with shaking hands, recognizing immediately that he'd discovered the original research archive. Detailed calculations, eclipse predictions, astronomical tables, geometric proofs, everything William's network had documented was here, hidden by the heretics themselves before their suppression. The tablets included names: William of Oxford, Samuel the mathematician, the Frank, Margaret the herbalist. Personal notes about observations, debates about methodology, concerns about church persecution. This wasn't just astronomical data. It was a complete intellectual autobiography of the network, written by people who knew they might die for their discoveries. Most remarkably, the tablets contained predictions extending far beyond 1330. Eclipse calculations reached to 1500. Planetary position tables covered a century. Lunar cycle documentation projected 200 years ahead. The network had created an astronomical prediction system that could be verified for generations, proving their method's accuracy long after their deaths. Bradwardine spent weeks transcribing the tablets, working in secret at an inn near Stonehenge. He understood that revealing this discovery would expose church authorities' suppression of accurate astronomical knowledge, the institutional lying about the 1330 eclipse, the imprisonment of scholars who'd been correct while orthodoxy was wrong. All of it would be documented and undeniable. He made copies, hiding them in different locations. One set went to Paris, where radical scholars would appreciate their significance. Another travelled to Italian universities where Renaissance humanism was embracing ancient wisdom. A third remained in England, concealed in Oxford's library among innocuous mathematical texts. The knowledge would survive regardless of what happened to Bradwardine personally. In 1424, he published a treatise on astronomical calculation that incorporated methods from the tablets without acknowledging their source. He presented the techniques as deriving from recently discovered Greek manuscripts, the same lie Samuel had used a century earlier. The methods worked brilliantly, allowing accurate eclipse predictions that impressed church astronomers while remaining theoretically orthodox. Cardinal Beaufort, one of England's most powerful churchmen, took interest in Bradwardine's work. He recognized superior astronomical capability and wanted to understand its source. Bradwardine found himself summoned to explain his methods, facing questions that probed uncomfortably close to the tablet's heretical origins. He navigated the interrogation by emphasizing Greek rather than Islamic or pagan sources, presenting ancient wisdom as Christian-compatible knowledge that had been temporarily lost. The strategy worked. Beaufort authorized further research, providing funding and protection. Bradwardine had accomplished what William couldn't, legitimizing forbidden knowledge by disguising its origins. But legitimization required ongoing deception. Bradwardine spent years carefully releasing discoveries from the tablets, while attributing them to various ancient sources. Each revelation had to seem plausible, orthodox compatible, unthreatening. The complete truth remained hidden while fragments entered mainstream scholarship. In 1428, another scholar made an independent discovery that threatened Bradwardine's careful strategy. A mason examining Salisbury Cathedral's geometry recognized patterns matching the Franks' documented instructions. He'd found architectural drawings from the 1320s showing deliberate incorporation of astronomical constants into sacred buildings. The drawings included marginal notes identifying the designer as a former Templar knight working with a Franciscan scholar. This mason, named John Thirsk, began investigating, unaware that Bradwardine was pursuing the same history from a different direction. Thirsk discovered references to the heresy investigation, found records of the Franks' imprisonment, traced architectural influences spreading from Salisbury across England and France. He independently reconstructed major elements of the network's story. Thirsk and Bradwardine finally met in 1429 at Oxford, each having discovered different pieces of the same puzzle. Their combined research created a comprehensive picture of what had occurred a century earlier: the network's formation, their forbidden research at Stonehenge, the accurate eclipse prediction, the suppression, and the knowledge's survival through encoded preservation. Together they faced a choice that would determine how history remembered these events. They could expose everything, documenting church suppression of accurate astronomical knowledge and institutional lying about the 1330 eclipse. Or they could continue the careful legitimization strategy, slowly integrating the discoveries into mainstream scholarship without revealing their origins. Thirsk wanted exposure. Truth deserved acknowledgement, he argued. The scholars who died for their discoveries deserved credit. Church authorities who'd suppressed knowledge deserved historical condemnation. Bradwardine urged caution. Exposing the suppression would make the knowledge controversial again, potentially triggering new investigations and restrictions. Better to succeed where William had failed, getting the knowledge accepted regardless of how credit was assigned. The debate became moot when Cardinal Beaufort learned about Thirsk's investigations. He summoned both men, demanding to know what they'd discovered about Salisbury's architectural history. The Cardinal was politically astute enough to recognise danger in questions about 14th century heresy cases and astronomical predictions. Bradwardine and Thirsk decided in that moment, without consultation, to protect the knowledge by denying its most controversial elements. They acknowledged finding old architectural plans and astronomical calculations, but claimed these represented conventional medieval scholarship of no particular significance. The Cardinal accepted their explanation but warned them against pursuing investigations that might uncover embarrassing historical errors. The warning was clear. Church authorities still feared this knowledge even after a century. The suppression remained official policy despite the suppressors being long dead. Truth was still dangerous when it challenged institutional authority. Bradwardine returned to Oxford, continuing his slow integration of the tablet's knowledge into accepted astronomy. Thirsk documented architectural patterns without explaining their origins. Both men became successful scholars, their careers built on foundations they couldn't acknowledge. They'd achieved practical victory. The knowledge was being used, while accepting historical defeat. William's network would remain officially forgotten. In 1433, Bradwardine became Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest ecclesiastical position in England. He held the office for only 40 days before dying of plague, but those 40 days gave him access to church archives that ordinary scholars couldn't see. He spent his brief tenure examining records of the 1330 investigation, finding confirmation of everything he'd reconstructed. He also found something unexpected: Brother Thomas's personal papers, including astronomical calculations the Dominican investigator had copied from William's research before burning the originals. Thomas himself had preserved the knowledge he'd condemned, recognizing its value despite declaring it heretical. This hypocrisy was Bradwardine's final discovery. Church authorities had always known the forbidden research was accurate. They'd suppressed it not because it was wrong, but because it was right in ways that threatened their authority. The entire century of concealment had been political rather than theological, protecting institutional power rather than doctrinal truth. Bradwardine died before he could act on this knowledge. His papers were scattered, his discoveries incomplete. But he'd accomplished enough. The tablet's content was now distributed across European scholarship, attributed to various ancient sources but functionally available to anyone with mathematical training. William's network had finally succeeded in their goal, preserving knowledge for future generations despite official suppression. The irony was complete. Church authorities who tried to destroy this knowledge had inadvertently preserved it through their own records. Scholars who'd concealed its origins had spread it more effectively than open publication could have. Truth had survived not despite deception, but through it, hidden in plain sight until recognition became inevitable. Renaissance astronomy would soon embrace heliocentric models. Gothic architecture would be analysed for its sophisticated geometry. Medical herbalism would be recognised as preserving astronomical knowledge. All would build on foundations laid by a 14th century network whose existence remained officially forgotten, but whose legacy was everywhere. Stonehenge stood in ruins, broken and vandalised, but its knowledge lived on in human civilization, embedded too deeply to erase, distributed too widely to suppress. The stones were dying, but their wisdom was immortal. The medieval attempt to destroy truth had failed utterly, and now, as the medieval world itself began dying, that truth was emerging into daylight, ready to transform human understanding forever. By 1450, the knowledge Williams network had risked everything to preserve was being used across Europe by scholars who had no idea of its origins. Renaissance astronomers employed calculation methods derived from the tablets, attributing them to recovered Greek manuscripts. Cathedral architects worked with proportions that encoded Stonehenge's geometry without knowing they were building ancient astronomical principles into Christian sacred spaces. A crucial transformation occurred during these decades. The knowledge stopped being controversial because it stopped being recognizable. Methods that had branded William a heretic in 1330 were standard astronomical practice by 1450. Islamic numerals and geometric techniques had been normalized through commercial use and architectural application. The context that made the research forbidden had dissolved, while the research itself flourished. In 1455, a German printer named Gutenberg demonstrated mechanical printing with movable type. Within 20 years, manuscript texts that had existed in handful of copies were being reproduced by the thousands. Margaret's herbal treatise was printed in 1472, reaching healers across Europe who'd never heard of astronomical timing methods, but applied them successfully. The knowledge's distribution accelerated beyond any possibility of suppression. Church authorities couldn't have prevented this spread even if they'd recognized the heretical origins. Printing technology made censorship impractical. Books banned in one city were printed in another. Ideas condemned by one bishop were celebrated by another. The decentralized information network that Williams' group had created manually was being replicated mechanically across the entire continent. In 1473, a Polish student named Nicholas Copernicus was born in Torun. He would eventually study astronomy using texts that incorporated methods from Bradwardine's publications, which drew on Williams' tablets, which encoded observations made at Stonehenge using techniques preserved from ancient builders. The chain of knowledge transmission was unbroken despite century-long suppression, connecting pagan monument to Renaissance revolutionary through invisible links. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, published in 1543, would shock Christian Europe by placing the sun at the cosmos's centre rather than Earth. Yet the mathematical foundations supporting his model derived partly from techniques Williams' network had employed to analyse Stonehenge's solar alignments. The controversial idea that had gotten medieval scholars imprisoned was becoming the basis for modern astronomy. Meanwhile, Stonehenge continued its physical decline. A storm in 1456 toppled the tallest remaining trilithon. Farmers dismantled several stones between 1460 and 1480, using them for livestock pens and cottage foundations. By 1500, less than half the original monument remained standing. The physical structure was being destroyed even as the knowledge it had helped preserve was transforming human civilization. In 1520, a shepherd boy exploring fallen stones discovered corroded bronze instruments buried in the ruins, remnants of William's measuring tools that had escaped earlier discovery. The boys sold them to a travelling merchant as scrap metal. They were melted down in Bristol, converted into door hinges and buckles. The last physical artefacts of the network's research were destroyed through ignorance of their significance. Yet the knowledge's influence expanded relentlessly. Architectural treatises published in Italy during the 1530s codified Gothic proportions that unknowingly preserved astronomical constants. Medical texts standardized herbal timing methods derived from Margaret's manuscript. Mathematical textbooks taught geometric principles that encoded eclipse calculations. The forbidden research had become so thoroughly integrated into European intellectual infrastructure that removing it would have required destroying Renaissance learning entirely. In 1540, King Henry VIII began dissolving English monasteries, seizing their lands and scattering their libraries. This destruction inadvertently protected some of William's encoded manuscripts. Dissolved monastery libraries were sold wholesale to collectors who preserved them without understanding their contents. Documents that might have been identified and destroyed under systematic church censorship survived through chaotic privatization. The dissolution also eliminated institutional memory of heresy cases. Monastic records documenting William's investigation were lost, burned, or scattered beyond recovery. By 1550, no accessible documentation remained proving that a 14th century network had studied Stonehenge for forbidden astronomical research. The suppression had succeeded in erasing the story, while failing to eliminate the knowledge. Stonehenge's reputation shifted during these decades from cursed site to romantic mystery. Tudor antiquarians began studying the monument, proposing theories about its builders and purpose. None came close to understanding its sophisticated astronomical functions, but their investigations normalized scholarly interest in the ruins. What had been forbidden in 1330 was fashionable curiosity by 1550. John Dee, Elizabeth III's court astronomer, visited Stonehenge in 1574 while researching ancient British history. He measured several stones, noting alignments that suggested astronomical purpose. His measurements unknowingly duplicated observations William had made 260 years earlier. Dee published theories about the monument being a druidic temple, missing entirely its function as a precision observatory, but establishing it as a legitimate subject for scientific inquiry. By 1600, astronomical methods derived from William's network were being taught openly at universities across Europe. Professors had no idea they were using techniques that medieval church authorities had condemned as heretical. The knowledge had been successfully laundered through multiple generations and attributions, emerging as respectable mainstream science indistinguishable from other recovered ancient learning. The tablets themselves remained at Stonehenge, still sealed in their lead box beneath a fallen stone. No one knew they existed. No one searched for them. The monument's primary function had shifted from active research site to passive symbol, a romantic ruin that inspired poetry and speculation, but not systematic scientific investigation. In 1620, King James III visited Stonehenge and commissioned architect Inigo Jones to determine its origins. Jones concluded it was a Roman temple, completely misunderstanding its age and purpose. His published drawings showed the monument in better condition than current reality. He'd restored fallen stones on paper, inadvertently creating historical documentation of the structure's 17th century state. His errors preserved more truth than his theories. The English Civil War brought renewed destruction to Stonehenge. Soldiers camped among the ruins in 1645, digging trenches that disturbed the ground without finding buried artifacts. A battle near the site in 1648 damaged several stones with cannon fire. Political violence was accomplishing what weather and neglect had begun. the monument's final destruction. Yet even this destruction couldn't eliminate the knowledge it had helped preserve. By 1650, that knowledge was distributed across hundreds of printed books, incorporated into thousands of buildings, practiced by tens of thousands of physicians and herbalists. William's network had achieved something more permanent than physical preservation. They'd embedded their discoveries into civilization's operating systems, making them functionally indestructible. Isaac Newton, born in 1642, would eventually develop laws of motion and gravitation using mathematical principles that traced indirectly back through Bradwardine to William's tablets. The chain of influence was impossible to document. Too many intermediate steps, too many lost attributions, but the intellectual lineage existed. Ancient knowledge encoded at Stonehenge contributed to Enlightenment physics through channels so convoluted that no one recognized the connection. In 1666, John Aubrey conducted the first systematic archaeological survey of Stonehenge, documenting the site's geometry with unprecedented precision. His measurements confirmed what William had calculated 3.5 centuries earlier. The monument embodied sophisticated astronomical understanding. But Aubrey had no way to know medieval scholars had already made these discoveries and been punished for them. The 18th century brought accelerating interest in Stonehenge as romantic nationalism drove searches for ancient British glory. Antiquarians proposed increasingly elaborate theories about Druids, Atlantis, and lost civilizations. The scholarly attention was welcome but increasingly disconnected from reality. Wild speculation obscured the monument's actual sophistication, replacing accurate understanding with fantasy. In 1740, William Stukely published the most influential study of Stonehenge to date, claiming it was a druidic temple aligned to solar and lunar cycles. He was partially correct. The alignments existed, but he attributed them to mystical priests rather than practical astronomers. His romantic druids became cultural fixtures, further burying the truth beneath attractive mythology. Meanwhile, the lead box containing William's tablets remained undiscovered. Stonehenge's ground had been excavated repeatedly by treasure hunters and antiquarians, but no one had dug in exactly the right location. The archive sat 2 feet below the surface, waiting for someone to find it by accident or intention. That discovery never came. In 1797, a farmer salvaging stone from a collapsed section of the monument broke through the lead box with his shovel. He found decomposed wax inside, unrecognizable as tablets, worthless as salvage. He discarded the debris without examination, destroying the last original documentation of the network's research. The complete archive William had preserved so carefully was lost forever, discovered accidentally and discarded ignorantly, 167 years after its creation. Yet this final destruction didn't matter. Everything important from those tablets had already been extracted, copied, distributed, and integrated into European knowledge systems. The originals were historically valuable, but scientifically redundant. Their destruction eliminated proof that medieval scholars had discovered certain principles centuries before official credit was assigned, but it couldn't eliminate the principles themselves. By 1800, astronomy had advanced far beyond anything William's network had achieved. Telescopes revealed planetary details ancient observers couldn't see. Calculus enabled predictions more precise than geometric methods allowed. But the foundational approaches, careful observation, mathematical analysis, hypothesis testing, were the same methodologies William had employed at Stonehenge. The intellectual framework had proven more durable than any specific discovery. The 19th century brought industrialization and scientific archaeology to Stonehenge. Systematic excavations began documenting the site's construction phases and chronology. Researchers determined the monument was approximately 4,000 years old, matching estimates Margaret had calculated based on precession measurements in 1315. The herbalist's dangerous conclusion that human civilization was older than biblical chronology suggested was now accepted mainstream science. Stonehenge's astronomical functions were finally recognized during the 20th century through research by Gerald Hawkins and others. Computer analysis confirmed the alignments William had measured by hand. Modern astronomers verified eclipse prediction capabilities using methods similar to those Samuel had employed. Everything the network had discovered was rediscovered, validated and credited to contemporary researchers who had no idea medieval scholars had preceded them. The monument itself became a protected national treasure, consolidated and partially restored during the 20th century. Fallen stones were re-erected, damaged sections were stabilized. The ruins that had been steadily disintegrating for 6 centuries were preserved at last, frozen in their partially destroyed state as a monument to both ancient wisdom and human curiosity. But the supreme irony was that protecting the physical monument came centuries after the knowledge it embodied had already been extracted, preserved, and integrated into human civilization. Stonehenge's scientific value had been fully realized by 1330 through William's network. Everything since was rediscovery of what had been learned and suppressed. The Church's attempt to destroy forbidden knowledge had failed absolutely. The knowledge survived while the suppressors were forgotten. William, Samuel, the Frank and Margaret had won their battle despite losing their lives. Truth had proven more durable than authority, more persistent than persecution, more valuable than safety. Their names were lost to history, their discoveries were attributed to others, their sacrifices went unrecognized, but their success was total and permanent. They'd preserved knowledge that helped transform medieval cosmology into modern astronomy, that influenced architecture across Europe, that saved lives through improved medicine, that demonstrated the power of observation over doctrine. Stonehenge stood on Salisbury Plain, weathered and incomplete, a testament to ancient engineering that medieval scholars had briefly understood before being silenced. The stones held no more secrets. Everything they could teach had been learned, documented, and distributed across human civilization. But the monument's symbolic power remained. It represented the eternal conflict between curiosity and authority, between observation and doctrine, between knowledge and power. William's network had fought that battle in 1314, had nearly lost in 1330, but had ultimately won through persistence, cleverness, and willingness to sacrifice personal recognition for collective progress. The forbidden research had become foundational science. The heretical calculations were now standard methodology. The dangerous observations were now established facts. Everything that had justified imprisonment and suppression was now taught to children as basic truth. Medieval authorities had succeeded in hiding the story. They'd failed completely at suppressing the knowledge. History forgot the heretics while preserving what they'd discovered. That outcome was both tragedy and triumph. Tragic for those who deserved credit, triumphant for truth itself. Stonehenge endured as monument to this victory, not the ancient builders' victory, though they deserved recognition too, but the victory of knowledge over ignorance, of persistence over persecution, of truth over power. The stones stood silent, but their message was clear to anyone who understood their history. Truth cannot be destroyed, it can only be delayed, and delay is temporary while truth is eternal. William's network had proven this principle through their lives, their deaths, and their legacy. They'd taken impossible risks for knowledge that wouldn't be recognized in their lifetime. They'd hidden discoveries so well that their very existence was forgotten. They'd succeeded so completely that no one knew they'd succeeded at all. That anonymity was the price of preservation. That obscurity was the cost of victory. They paid it willingly, knowingly, inevitably. and centuries later, their payment had purchased the modern world. A world where astronomy was science rather than heresy, where observation outranked authority, where truth could be discovered by anyone willing to look carefully and think clearly. Stonehenge's forbidden research had never been forgotten. It had simply become so fundamental, so integrated, so obvious that no one recognized it as having once been forbidden at all. The stones stood silently under English skies, holding the secret of their own vindication. They'd taught ancient builders how to track the cosmos. They'd taught medieval scholars how to challenge authority. They'd taught modern humans that some knowledge is worth any price, any sacrifice, any cost. That lesson endured, carved not in stone, but in human civilization itself, permanent as mathematics, lasting as truth, inevitable as dawn. The medieval attempt to suppress Stonehenge's research had failed, and in that failure, humanity had won.